I love that quote. I think
I love it.
okay, we're on. All right.
We're
Well,
on.
hello everyone. There's no one watching us right now, but there are people in the future. So welcome future people um to the show. So this is my third video on my fledgling YouTube channel, and I'm joined today with Time and Klein. Time and Klein, what do you're like the super editor of American Reformer now. You're like
Yeah,
the
the maximum editor.
Ubermensch sort of editor guy
Exactly. Yeah,
publishing Nietzschean articles or whatever. No,
that's exactly how I'd put it. Yeah.
yeah, no. So yeah, from American Reform and all that, great guy. Hillsdale grad too, so he's a part of that mafia.
I'm not a Hillsdale grad.
I thought
That's
you
Ben.
were. Okay, I
No,
don't know.
I
Whatever.
make fun
Whatever.
of the
This is
Hillsdale
this is
Mafia all the time.
obnoxious banter that I'm against at the beginning of any sort of podcast. So we're gonna end the
You're
banter.
right.
So what we're gonna do
Yeah.
today is we're gonna talk a little bit about so Bill Roach, and I don't know if you know him or not, but I believe he has a PhD in philosophy. He's been kind of an anti-Christian nationalist guy for the last few weeks. He went on the Jenna Ellis show, and Jenna Ellis, I didn't really know her very well, but suddenly she called me a snake, and so got my attention. That was enough, and she interviewed him, Bill Roach, for her show that's on YouTube. Um, Posted on her. She has 1 million followers on Twitter, which
Oh,
is congratulations. That's pretty cool. But we're gonna kind of react to some of what they are saying here. I don't know how long we might we might go until like 1 in the morning. I don't know. See how long this goes. But yeah. So you ready, Timon?
I'm ready, man.
So this is my first time trying to manage this nonsense. So bear with me, watcher, viewer. There he is.
This is
All
Bill.
right. This is Bill Roach, Dr. Bill Roach.
Hmm.
So I'm going to call him Bill because we both have PhDs. So I'm going to assume I can do that. But all right. So he's reacting. This is on minute 12, 12:15 or 12:20. They did some introductions before and some things that kind of intro sort of thing. They didn't get to specifics. So let's just jump in right here, and we can whenever you want. I can stop, or you just jump in, Timon. So,
Okay.
all right, let's go.
We saw this happen over the last few years, and I was hoping that the evangelical church would have kind of caught on to it. I don't think they did. And like you were saying, when you look at the whole woke movement, you notice how it worked. You can be woke depending on how you define the term, who actually gets to define the term. And did you notice this? There's this fancy term. It's usually something like epistemic privileged place or epistemic privileged point. And what they mean by that is that if you are from a particular perspective or from a particular point of view, you have greater status to speak on something. And we know how that worked with the woke movement, is that if you held a certain race or a certain intersectionality point, you had the privilege because you have the special knowledge to discuss this particular issue. And what's interesting is that it ended up being this silencer of conversation with people, that if you don't hold that, you either don't know it, you can't know it, you can't speak to it. So you just have to trust and obey exactly what we're saying. And it's funny because that's exactly what Christian nationalists are doing it.
Okay, exactly what Christian nationalists are doing. They're doing the same woke, evasive, um, uh, epistemological privileging of certain voices
I don't
over.
know what that means.
Yeah, I mean, I think I kind of know what he's getting at, the idea of kind of within the woke circles. Well, I mean, you know all about this stuff, isn't
Well,
there?
yeah,
You know more than I do about this.
I get the no, I get the I mean, insofar as you're talking about what the woke did as your identity markers or whatever, your intersectional makeup gives you a certain epistemic privilege, but I don't understand I mean, you've seen a lot of people do this, try to analogize between woke stuff that was going on to now Christian nationalism, and I don't really follow most of it. I don't really understand the analogy. I don't think it's a very good analogy, but in this case in particular, I don't really. I'm not understanding where he's trying to draw the parallel. Like who's making that claim? I mean, essentially you're the only person they mention, right? In the whole in the whole segment. So how
Yeah,
does this apply to
it's
you?
really not like it's not clear to me who's saying that there's a sort of epistemic privilege to define it. I think maybe what he's getting at is that if you go on Twitter, you'll see all sorts of different people saying this or that. This is Christian nationalism. That is Christian nationalism.
Hmm.
But then he's taking it to be holistically to be a sort of strategy that we're all somehow, me and a bunch of
Right,
anons
right,
get together, all hundreds of us get together in the back channels and we strategize like, okay, you're going to
yeah,
say this ridiculous thing. I'm going to say this ridiculous thing. And it's all going to be
right,
contradictory. And then we're going to like gaslight them and saying they don't actually know what the
right.
definition is. When really it's just a bunch of people saying a bunch of stuff. It's not coordinated.
Mhm.
But it's turned into this kind of like conspiracy, like grand strategy rather than like the simpler way to understand what's going on is that it's kind of an early movement. It's an early idea.
Mhm.
And a lot of people are trying to figure out what they believe, how they articulate it, how they define it, what they mean by it, what the program is for, Christian nationalism. Some people who don't even want to take the label, they still want to take some ideas of the politics and they're
Mhm.
still, they're sympathetic. And so they'll say, this is what it is. It's not what it is. It's not like some grand strategy of saying you can't define it, you can't say what it is.
Yeah. Yeah, and maybe this is kind of like you're saying, just an effect of the stage. I mean, when I was talking to Jared Longshore several months ago about some of this, not just Christian nationalism, but things going on the evangelical right or whatever we want to call it, and my understanding or kind of assessment of the situation is we're still in a very much like an incubation stage of ideas, and they're still, like you said, being worked out and proposed, and a lot of that is just occasion to recover old ideas from the tradition. And so yeah, it looks a little messy and no one has control of it, and not everything is rigidly defined, and it's very much at least as I've experienced it, it's very much a conversation. But I haven't really seen I mean, I think he's kind of talking about a gatekeeping function, and maybe what Bill has experienced is when they say ridiculous things, the opponents, I guess, of Christian nationalism. So I mean, he's a sovereign nations guy, right? So it's that kind of crowd, and we tell them that they're wrong in in their assessment of the ideas in play. Then they get frustrated, and we tell them, well, you may not have the operative categories to engage well with this if you haven't read certain things, and then maybe that comes across as a sort of gatekeeping function. But I would just see it as a earnest sort of attempt to bring people up to speed. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think what we'll see, the theme I get from the broad kind of interview and what he says is the strategy here is to instead of dealing with the arguments, say, of my book and kind of the complexity of them and the distinctions, it's easier, and also instead of seeing that it's based in older ideas of Protestant, like the Protestant
Hmm.
reformers and the development in centuries later, instead of seeing it in that light, which would be more favorable. It's like, oh,
Hmm.
you quote Calvin and you quote the founders and you quote Witherspoon and you quote these, and talk about
Hmm.
Cotton Mather, like all that sounds to a Christian. Okay, I respect those guys to a certain degree. I can listen to this. But that's too favorable. And so instead, the strategy is to say, okay, it's Marxist, it's
Hmm.
neo-Marxist, it's cultural Marxist, it's postmodern, it's fascist, it's we know Hitler comes up later on in the video.
Of course.
It's all these things that are scary that
Hmm.
so that's what it is. It's all these things that violate the founding. It's like if you got a bunch of people who are over like 65 in a room, this is the message you would give them and they'd be terrified. Oh, this is
Hmm.
because their entire lives the greatest enemy is Marxism and Hitler, or Marxism and
Hmm.
fascism. And so if you frame everything in that light, um that makes it scary. So that means
Yeah.
nothing else. It really is a sort of poisoning in the well. I think we'll see this later on. I'm kind of getting ahead of myself a little bit, but you see kind of a poisoning of the well, meaning that no matter how much of a distinction I make. So if I say, yeah, I did say that a civil ruler may um, punish blasphemy, may punish heresy, may do this and that. Okay, may do
Yeah.
that. And then I say, well, permissibility doesn't mean suitability in every situation. And I apply that distinction, which is a classical distinction that everyone made until yesterday. And I say it explicitly in the book several times. That distinction is rejected because, oh, you're just trying to trick us. You're postmodern. You're just trying to, you're shifting you're doing the Mott and Bailey. It's one of those things. Instead of dealing with the arguments in themselves, you have this very deep suspicion that it's ultimately Marxist, fascist, Hitlerist, or whatever. And anyway, so I'm getting ahead of
that's that. We talked about that on that Spaces the other night. Of this is kind of a new one, at least that I've noticed, is the characterization of the breakdown you just gave of a distinction between principle and prudence as being sort of disingenuous, or like you said, a Mott and Bailey maneuver, rather than just the correct posture to approach, politics. So very basic. I don't really get that. It's certainly not. I mean, I'm certainly perfectly willing to admit all the things in principle I believe in, such as punishing blasphemy, whatever. But then also very willing to say it has to be prudentially orchestrated, and you have to, whatever, lead men to virtue gradually, these sorts of things. And I don't see them as contradictory, but these guys seem to, I don't know, think that they've sort of smoked us out, at that point of like, now we're really revealing our true intentions, which is to, I guess, trick everybody. I don't know. It's very bizarre.
Yeah. And that's been the most frustrating thing about the book, is that like the loudest voices, I mean, on a different note, I guess, or related note, well, the most frustrating thing for me is that you can't, well, like with people, and I've never talked with, I don't think Bill directly, I've talked to people he's associated with the Sovereign Nations crowd and just that kind of orbit. And I remember it was a few months ago. I think I spent 3 hours discussing something with someone that everyone here knows. I don't know if you know, but for 3 hours. And by the end of it, I thought, like, this is a guy who talks about rationality. He's a guy who talks about reason and, natural this and that. After 3 hours, there was no progress in the conversation, like zero progress. Like, even if like if you and I disagree on something, I think that you and I could talk it out. And even if in the end, we'd still disagree, like we've refined the arguments, we've defined the terms, we've clarified, we've come to some understanding of our positions much better than before. But most of the critics of Christian nationalism are the opposite. You could spend hours talking to them and you make zero progress. And I think it's from this very kind of posture that you see right off the bat here, which is that, I mean, we'll see later, that it's like you're trying to frame them in these dark, scary post-war sort of terminology that just prevents the actual progress. And you know what I mean? And it's just, that's been the most frustrating part about it. Like the loudest people, I could just say, no, I don't affirm that, or I distinguish this from that. And it doesn't matter at all. And they'll just they'll keep saying what they originally said over and over and over. And like I've said, it's like before, it's like whack-a-mole. Like one guy says this, whack, and another guy said that, whack, and then the other guy who just said something, he says it again, whack. I mean, it's pointless for me to spend my days doing that. Anyway, I'm just venting on that frustration.
No, I think that's right. I mean, anyone that follows your Twitter, I mean, that's essentially what it's filled up with, and your replies to people. So, whatever. At some point, especially, it's this crowd. I mean, it's the G3 crowd to some extent. That's as this type of engagement. There's other people that are opposed to maybe some of your ideas or Christian nationalism as a label, whatever. But it seems to be these two groups in particular, which obviously have overlap, that have sort of executed the strategy you're talking about, where it's clearly not meant to be a debate or a real discussion, but they're appealing to certain constituencies that they probably think you're strategically targeting to try to steal away from them or something. I'm not sure, but they're clearly not they're not there to really engage the ideas or even try to. It's pretty one-dimensional.
Yeah, I think that's what like the Charles Haywood thing was all about. I've never talked to the guy on the phone. I don't think I've ever exchanged emails with the guy. I know of him. I guess I've read a couple things by him. But but then somehow he becomes like the dark center of Christian nationalism and
Yeah.
integralism and all these things. And I'm just sitting back like,
Yeah.
what is going on? Why can't you just deal with my argument? Here's a syllogism.
Yeah.
Like which premise is false? Where's
Yeah.
the invalid reasoning? Like, let's go with that level
Yeah.
instead of dark and notorious Charles Haywood is like,
Yeah.
paying Wolf on the side it's just crazy stuff.
And Nate Fisher owns a ammo company or whatever else.
Yeah, it's
very sinister stuff.
Yeah,
it's I mean that maybe that helps them make sense of things, and it's kind of got to be that way, or they're maybe they're just predisposed to expect that because it's new, it's scary. I don't know, but it does continually reveal their lack of familiarity with the tradition. Not that you can't disagree with aspects of the tradition or try to refine it or apply it in new ways, but they're because it seems so foreign to them, obviously based on their reception of the ideas, means they're unfamiliar. And then further, I mean, what you're getting at is the type of engagement. If you spend enough time in older texts, I think it changes the way you engage with arguments generally, and especially ones that are presented in the similar format, whether it's syllogistic or just this sort of style of using the tradition itself to make arguments, which is done in a certain way, and it's not considered to be out of bounds or sidestepping scripture or whatever else. So all those sort of preliminary, I think they're distractions, but preliminary objections that I thought eventually we'd get past them and be like an initial hurdle, and it's like, well, that's fine. It's evangelicalism. They're conditioned to think a certain way and expect certain types of arguments from their leaders. So that's what they're expecting. This defies expectations. But eventually they'll all get tired of just doing that. And if they're going to engage further, the objections will move to a different place. But they've pretty much hung out, at least for certain people we're talking about, in the same area for like a year, which is really weird.
Yeah. It's been pretty frustrating. And then like there have been, I mean, I complain about these people, but there have been good engagements of the book. But those, at least one in particular, was like, well, Hegel, like you just Hegelian, and that's un-American, which is a fine argument. I'm not against, like, I don't think it's wrong in principle, but it doesn't actually deal with anything particular. Like I could, fine, it's Hegelian, maybe it's still true. But yeah, obviously as an American, I don't want to avoid being un-American. But nevertheless, those were, and then there's some other ones. Well, you want to keep going?
Yeah, let's keep going.
We've done like 5
let's
seconds.
Do more, Bill. Yeah.
If you don't have their epistemic privilege place of which you can address this topic, or if you define it a little differently, or whichever means they're going to give you, you don't have the rights and the privilege to speak to it. Sounds woefully similar, doesn't it? Because what it sounds a lot Hegelian like tactic.
I don't know what he's talking about. I don't know anyone who said you don't have a right to speak on this. And we've said like do the reading, but that's because they fail to make like the basic distinctions at times. And so we're like, look, you guys just. And it also became kind of a joke too, because eventually, like, you have to be a little snarky just because you see the same dumb stuff over and over, and you try to correct it over and over, and they don't care. So you're going to be just, in the end, you're going to say what I say is like, try to think clearly or one of these lines that, what else are you going to do?
No, the do the reading one is my favorite. I mean, I use it for all kinds of contexts. It's not just for Christian nationalism, and it's basically a thing of, I mean, it means what it says, but it's also, somewhat tongue in cheek or lighthearted. I'm not telling anyone they can't engage. In fact, I would love for them to actually take that request seriously, and that would be a huge win. Actually, if you can just get them to read the stuff, they don't have to agree, but if they would actually just go read it. I was like joke with this Richard Baxter course I'm teaching. Started with Michael Lynch. I was joking like with people signing up that I did do a shameless plug. Starts next week, so it's too late to sign up.
Okay.
But I was joking on Twitter when people were expressing interest of like, if anyone showed up not doing the reading, they'd get the Baxter meme that says please do the reading, like in their inbox every week. So it's just a joke, but if in some ways it is earnest. It would be great if they would read read the Institutes from Calvin and the Institutes from Turretin, in a detailed way without some of your evangelical priors, modern ones. And even if you come away still disagreeing, that would be great. I just imagine most of these people have not done that. So please do the reading, then come back and we can engage on the, the material, the source material. I don't know why that's so weird, but if he doesn't mean that, if that's not what it is in mind for him, then I have absolutely zero idea what he's talking about.
Yeah. I think it's I mean, if it's sincere, I think he's just mistaken his analogy or this comparison that it's we're just woke or we're just like the woke and therefore bad. Another thing, just to kind of an aside, I guess, of what you just said. So I like to tell people that if you're going to read kind of the original sources, don't read them with the frame of what you've heard in the last few decades. So if you're thinking, Calvin's a theonomist, and so I'm going to read him in that light, or Calvin's your favorite postmillennialist, and that's, you have to think of him in that terms. I would just kind of not do that. Like try to think of what he's saying in his own terms. That's just a suggestion. Or
even Calvin the proto-liberal, is another one not to do.
Yeah, don't do that. Yeah, that's
for sure.
What's his name? Does that Tuininga or whatever? Didn't he?
Yeah, that book was frustrating to me. That was a few years ago I read it, but yeah, I think that if I remember right, not trying to misrepresent, but that's essentially where he ends up, and then you drive that into like the American context, and it's like, so now Reformed people can be proud of liberal secular America because it's really all in Calvin, So it's like, okay, great.
Yeah, that went wrong. Okay, let's see here. Go back to
a postmodern tactic to stop conversation to achieve long-term goals, and like you said, the long-term goal is to ultimately nullify religious freedom and freedom of speech in the public sphere.
Yeah, it sounds
okay.
So to nullify freedom of speech and religious. So we'll get more of the, they just want to destroy the Constitution line later. I don't know if we want to put that off, but I think, well, first of all, when he said like shut down conversation, I don't think we're the ones doing that.
Right.
I am very open to talking. I mean, I'm pretty lazy when it comes to writing, I admit, but I'm pretty open to like talking to people about these ideas and to work out our differences. But it's, if you're just going to say you guys are postmodern Marxists and like, I don't know, how do I just deny it? If I deny it, you're probably going to say that confirms, so, I'm Kafka trapped.
Right. And you're not going to, denying over and over and over. If you had someone who was in good faith coming to you and confused and just said, hey, this, are you this? You would have an incentive there to deny it and then explain to them. But, these sort of Twitter quips and jabs or whatever, then you're usually blocked after a while. If you engage too much in a way they don't like, then, this is not as, it's certainly not a good faith scenario. So denying over and over that you're an authoritarian or something, it just gets tedious and pointless. So, but we can, the religious liberty thing in particular, we can sort of package that with, because I think he gets to like free speech, which I guess he's already touching on here, religious liberty, and then there might be a couple. It's really the Bill of Rights he's talking about, not the constitutional structure or order. I don't think they get into that. So really, they're going to talk about the Bill of Rights, and we can hit them all in a block once they get.
So let's keep going then.
a lot like the left saying no uterus, no opinion. You're a man, you can't speak on abortion. If you're white, then you can't speak to the Black experience. Or conversely, by saying, well, if you're not a biologist, you can't.
I've never talked about a uterus.
And so they
before
use both
Twitter.
of these, both the experiential and the epistemological, as well as their experts and their credentials, to then excise anyone from public speech and debate whose opinions they don't want, and they can censor anyone, and they can ultimately go back to this totalitarian society and this kind of authoritarianism that they prefer. So we have to take a break right here, but I'm speaking with Dr. Bill Roach, and we're talking about the importance of understanding Christian nationalism.
Do we have our own sponsors or an ad to take a break too? Or?
No, I don't. I don't have I don't have any sponsors yet.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe I should start doing an ad for like our goat milk. Like, I'll ship you. We have goat milk for
Wolfshire
sale.
goat milk.
Yeah, Wolfshire goat milk. Maybe some eggs. Mix in some eggs with that.
People will pay for that, man.
Yeah, goat milk gets goaty after a while, though, so you don't want.
That's true. I'm not a huge.
No, I mean,
goat
at
milk
first,
fan.
it's good. At first, it's almost like
yeah.
cow's milk, but then you let it sit for a little while, it gets a little gross. But whatever.
Yeah, when I was growing up overseas, we couldn't get, cow's milk, so it was like I had a lot of goat milk stuff as a kid. And I just never got a taste for it. Like goat milk and cereal is something's off about it. It's just not quite there. But anyway.
Well, you're gonna have to come to our house, and anyway, this is a.
Yeah, I need to get the good stuff.
No one wants to hear about Wolfshire goat milk right now on Twitter.
We don't know that. There could be a market.
Maybe they do. Maybe I'm probably getting emails about this.
The things that Stephen does in his book and other figures try to do, and there are other books on it, is they want to just give this slam down definition. And I think they realize that obviously words in different movements have to be defined. There has to be a parameter within that. I give them good faith in that regard. But then you'll notice these interesting little things that they're doing. They say, we don't want to discuss it historically. And the reason they'll say that is because there's too much baggage, or maybe it clouds their definition, or whatever means they're going to give to it. But I go, that's precisely where we need to go. So when you look at the history of
so I think actually of everything he says, this is the most legitimate objection. I think everything else is horrible, but I think this is the most legitimate objection, to give him credit. And because I do in the introduction say, I don't care what you think nationalism is or isn't. I'm going to define it. I'm going to describe what I'm describing, and whether or not historical examples overlaps or whatever, or doesn't, is up to you to decide. And one of the reasons was that I didn't approach the topic thinking, oh, there's this historical phenomenon called nationalism. Let me try to define what nationalism is historically as a bunch of, use a bunch of cases and then come build this theory of what it is, and then try to fit Christian nationalism into that. And so I didn't want to do that. Obviously, first of all, because I think it'd be boring to do. And second of all, I don't think it'd be fruitful to approach it that way. I said, I want to define this conceptually and start with what a nation is, work myself way into nationalism. So I don't think, so I know people have disagreed with this. I think it's a legitimate criticism. I don't think it's ultimately successful. And it wasn't me trying to avoid bad examples. It was me simply trying to avoid that method of, again, compiling cases, building a theory, and then trying to fit my theory into that theory. So yeah, I don't know what you think about that.
And he no, I mean it's not in your book, it's a theoretical and polemical choice that's not hidden. So therefore it's not illegitimate. Yeah. Someone can disagree with the conclusions you come to, or even they could even disagree with the definition, which I guess is part of the conclusion of the method, but they could disagree with the definition you use, and even use historical examples to try to poke holes in it. But I think, one of the things, at least as I read it, I thought that was a useful tactic on your part, because for the exact reason that we're dealing with Bill Roach, which is you're just going to insist upon talking about post 20th century, nationalism as defined by historians and sort of imposed upon certain social and political phenomenon of that period. And if you're really appealing to sources and ways of politically organizing that stand behind that, then it would make little sense to engage with the mountains of, literature on quote unquote nationalism, fascism, all these things from the 20th century. That would be kind of strange to do. At the same time, so I can't remember exactly where he goes here. I think he's going to talk about Hitler for sure. He can't not do that. But then, I've written about, some of these things, not in a comprehensive way, but certain elements of recovery of certain political ideas. I do like to use historical examples. They're just all like 17th and 18th century ones. And we'll say, this is kind of the way of life, or this is the way of doing law and governance that I would like us to get back to in some regard, adjusted for prudence and circumstance. I know that means I'm obfuscating, but I do think that that's real. So I've done some of that using this, but it's not to arrive at like really a definition. It's just to describe a certain picture of things and to demonstrate that a lot of the ideas now in play, mostly because of your book, but some, it's highlighted not only things in your book, but because of your book, other things other people have said, some have also come in. It's been sort of an outlet to get them in. Some of those ideas, they have been illustrated. And what I like to emphasize is in our own country, on our own soil, not that long ago. And so they're not really foreign. So the charge that you're just bringing in, even though I've used these two 19th century papal encyclicals or something, is bunk, basically, because you can find ideas I want here. So I've done that some, but I don't think at the same time, I'm also just avoiding, some of these, they're almost like they're like prerequisites for a lot of people in their brains to talk about politics at all, have to channel through, or at least pass through the channel that is, the post-war order, especially if you're going to critique it at all. And then of course that's built upon this foundation of what happened in the 20th century and the two world wars that is supposed to be the perpetual motivation for being liberal, being anti, pre-liberal, being modernist, all these things. So I find it tedious and boring. So I thought that the choice to attempt to sidestep that, knowing it's going to be imposed on you at some point anyway, because certain people just can't think otherwise, was at least a noble effort. I mean, I've said the same thing about several things you do in the book of like, well, no one else was trying to do anything. So like, can you really fault someone's attempt when it's the first one, when you're just rejecting the attempt, at the outset? I don't think that's a fair critique. If you could point to a better attempt at dealing with, whatever the definition of a nation, the use and definition of an older way of thinking about ethnicity or whatever, like no one else is really trying to work with those concepts in that way. So I think it's pretty cheap to just say, well, it's definitely wrong because see Hitler. I don't know. It's just pretty boring. So whatever.
Yeah, boring is a kind of key word there. And I also, so one of the things I wanted, I'm very kind of self-conscious of this, and this one reason why I talk about kind of the post-war period a lot is that we have certain habits of our mind that even if the idea we're proposing doesn't lead to something that Hitler did or something nasty in the 20th century, move like, right wing or far, whatever we want to call these movements, political orders, we habitually then say, well, I'm not saying that we should be Nazis. I'm not saying we should be fascists. I repudiate fascism and this and that.
Yeah.
You're really playing upon and reinforcing that habit to deny a bunch of stuff that doesn't actually follow from what you said originally. Like that is the conservative mindset. It's like you say, I want this policy, and all of a sudden you have to start saying, okay, I'm not a racist, I'm not xenophobic, I'm not this and that. You have to start listing everything you're not. And so one of the reasons was like, well, I'm not going to just right off the bat start listing. Of course I repudiate fascism and Nazism. When if you read the book, I don't affirm anything like sort of political theory that would be Nazi. I'm citing people older, so I wasn't going to go run through that sort of game that conservatives play. And if that caused people, I think what happens, and I knew this would happen, that sort of thing causes conservatives to be uncomfortable. Like, oh, he mentioned the word nationalism or like ethnicity, and he didn't like repudiate all forms of racism and all that. There's that habit in the mind, and I'm not going to play into that habit and reinforce it, because I think we got to get away from that silly kind of it's
a contrived instinct, and if you were to have done those things, list your affirmations and denials at the outset, like a good boy is supposed to do, then it does, as you're saying, reinforce and play into that mode of analysis and those ideological they're priors, and it's definitely right to call them values, because they're really, it's to show you have the proper moral standing to then engage in things that might be, dangerous to them or something. So you get those out in the open, and you'd probably still end up with the same accusations. They just call you a liar, So it's fine. You're sneaking it in. But it's also just dumb. I think it is. And speaking of historical analysis from Bill, like there were funny articles back before, like when Trump was first running, that were talking about like how no one can actually give a good like on the street, or pundits, they can't really give a definition of fascism. Like it's just a word you just use for things that make you uncomfortable and you don't like, and they seem overbearing or whatever. And no one actually knows. And then I think this was actually like Foreign Policy Magazine or something. It was called like the F word, I think was the name of the article. And it went through like how unique of a historical phenomenon Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany were, to the extent that you probably can't ever replicate them again. And there might be a few examples that passed also within the 20th century, but it's not replicable because so many conditions, and that's like what fascism is. Like it's this thing, it's a political, social phenomenon of a particular time in history. And like in theory, in a sort of infinite universe, you could replicate it, but it probably won't happen again. And so to keep saying that's fascist, this is fascist, is the article, this was not a conservative guy or anything, was like, this is really dumb to just keep throwing around. It just makes no sense. I mean, none of it really does. You can say someone's doing bad things without calling them a fascist, or saying that their view of like government and political action is too robust or too muscular and overbearing, and they're still not doing a fascism. Like it's very unlikely that they're doing a fascism. Even these like not neo-Nazi LARPers or whatever in like Orlando, it's really unfair to call them. I know they want to be Nazis and they may want to be fascists, but they're really neither, because there's no category that exists for those people. It's like saying I'm a Templar Knight. Like I'm just not, because it doesn't exist. Like there's no outlet for me to be that, whether it's good or bad. Like it just doesn't exist. So it's goofy, and it's especially goofy than be afraid of it. Like if I got 200 people together and said we're all going to be, Templars, it's probably not a huge domestic or national security threat. Anyway, that's a big rabbit trail, but it just frustrates me all the time that people deal with things that dumb. Something could be bad. You can disagree with something without needing to resort to like the ultimate trump card, which is the real F word. So anyway.
Yeah. No, I mean, but that is the rhetoric of our time, which is to, I don't know if this was true in the past or not, but at least in our time, that's like the argument is nothing but saying that's socialism or that's communism or that's not conservative, and it's saying what it is, and like it's scary terminology, and so there's no actual argument. It's just trying to link it up with some term that's scary, but or evil or wrong or whatever. But all right, let's keep going here.
Right, let's move
this issue. The best way to understand Christian nationalism in its just barest sense is what's known as integralism. Integralism is ultimately this idea where we're going to have a mixing of the church and the state. And primarily what you're going to find is that you're going to see the state enforcing the church's laws on different matters. So that's a broad concept, but when you look at it historically and you look at integralist movements within the West, that's precisely what we find, whether it's with Constantine or you're going to find it within greater Europe. You even find this, ironically, within certain segments of Protestantism. You find Calvin doing it within Geneva. You even find it in, for example, we were in Boston recently. We took a vacation up there.
All right, he's about to get into the annoying Quaker thing.
We'll keep save it for its own.
Yeah. So integralism and integralism. So you've used the term positively in the past. I don't like it just because I don't like the Roman Catholic integralists, and so I'm not going to say I am one. I mean, I know you have, like, we both have thoughts on this, like the merging of church and state. One of the like frustrating things, I'm sure, like hearing that the merging of church and state is just how imprecise that terminology is. Like in the later on, they'll say the founders, everyone affirmed a sort of separation between jurisdictions and church. Like we're like, so do we.
Yeah.
Totally. So there's like this. Yeah. So when we say like do the reading or you don't know what you're talking about, this is the sort of thing we're talking about, like merging church and state. It's again, it's not precise. And if you understood our distinctions, you still may disagree. But at least we'd come to an understanding, right? I mean, of what we mean. We do believe in separate jurisdictions, separate powers, or, you know, like separate swords, separate offices.
Even the Roman Catholics can affirm all that. The Roman Catholic integralists would agree with all that. That's what's hilarious, is like the real debate to have between the Roman Catholic integralists, you know, of course, has to do with the papacy and general ecclesiology and things. But if you didn't have the Pope, let's just say the church and the two powers, the temporal and spiritual, the two swords, the real debate you'd have between them is there a priority of one over the other? Is it a hierarchy? Are they parallel? Are they, to what extent and in what ways are they complementary? And the mutual sort of diaconal role. Those are all like the fun things to talk about that were actually, the Erastians debated in the 17th century. I mean, I know in your book you use some Gillespie. You know, I think his position wins and is probably best reasoned in that regard. So anyway, your debate, and it gets, those debates themselves got tedious, and but even the Erastians are saying, like, we're not trying to subvert church discipline or steal the keys of the church. This is for the sake of civil order. Baptism or rather the Lord's Supper is so important. To discipline people with that is not good. It's these sort of complicated arguments in the weeds, but no one is merging church and state into one unit. Even if you have, as an Erastian or British Protestant, generally accept the king as a certain kind of head of the church, no one's saying that the keys to the church, that its powers being taken and subverted by the civil power, any of those things. I mean, even as I said, the best kind of Roman Catholic integralists today, who are all drawing off 19th century stuff, Pater Waldstein and Thomas Pink at King's College London, I think, are the best guys to read on that. You'll see that they don't do that. Their thing is just, but I think the church is supreme, and there should be a certain kind of deference from the state to the church. And I've argued there's a certain kind of deference. It's just different than the way they do it. And so that's why for a while I was playing around with that label. I'm still fine with it, but it didn't really catch on, whatever. But the point is, you can have a really interesting debate with lots of distinctions, and different models could emerge that we might even be able to come to some agreement on. But when you just do this thing and you talk about, they want to merge church and state, we want to keep them separate, that's not an interesting debate.
Yeah, I have the sense that they both want to, in a way, say that that when they talk about, like you mentioned, church laws, which I'm guessing could refer to like the first table sort of laws.
I have no idea. Yeah.
And then the state should enforce first, like the Christian laws, which would be like, I guess, first table sort of laws. I mean, really, in itself, blasphemy laws with regard to like atheism and polytheism are actually not distinctively Christian. So I think there's things break down along those lines. So I think they want to say that the state has no, in principle, no jurisdictions over things that concern religious life or religious actions, which I guess can be include, which extends to someone denying religion or denying God. And so that's how they want to make that distinction. Which we would say, like, historically, that's not the case in America. They'll get into the fact, they'll assume this is like the American experiment is precisely along those lines, when it's really not. But yeah, I don't get the sense that either of them kind of know what our position would be. Yeah. And they assume that their position, which I think, as I might have like steelmanned it a little bit for them, is like the only acceptable position, so that there is no, like, the civil power has no jurisdiction over outward religious expression unless it somehow violates the second table. So no child sacrifice, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Which is historic. I mean, he was saying earlier he wants this to be a historical argument. I mean, there's even interesting issues there, because I assume both of them, as with most Americans, are not even going to blink at the fact that the state has things to say in our society now about marriage. And I don't even mean just with like the gay marriage issue, but marriage generally. It has jurisdiction, regulation of marriages, those things. There's certain places in history, in Western history, could be dropped down where that would not be the case, right? That would be a purely ecclesial jurisdiction, and it would be considered a sort of theft by this temporal power to try to singularly regulate those without any kind of interaction with the church. So it's like, this is not the only model you could have, and there's a debate you could have on that. If you think it's so cut and dry, but you want it to be historically informed, it's going to become less cut and dry as you go, which forces you to actually talk about in principle, what's acceptable, to define the terms you're using. And I'm sure that some of this, they would say the distinctions we're making are distinctions without a difference. That just, if you think the state has any kind of religious interest whatsoever, it's carrying water for the church, therefore you've effectively merged them, which I think is sloppy, but I'm sure that in some ways that's what they're thinking, that there's not enough separation between the two, or a distinction.
Yeah. And I think another thing is that, like, for our position, I think you have the same position, that the state or the civil power can touch upon things like external things that would be religious, because that's actually good for society. Like, it's if let's say that, like, the primary interest of civil power are the outward things at the second table. Well, if you want those people to flourish with regard to civil virtue, you also need piety. And I mean, we'll get into the founders in a little bit, but it was pretty much universally recognized, and Mark David Hall has shown this, that there is, like, even Madison would affirm that, you need a sort of religious Christian Protestant people to ensure that there will be these sort of civic virtues in society. And so that's why a lot of people, including like Washington and others, and John Adams and George Mason, all these guys would see the need for some kind of civil involvement in religion, because there was an interest in, I mean, apart from like supporting the eternal good, that is like ordering to the highest good, there's an interest simply in the earthly goods. Religious people are a happier people. The religious people are going to follow the second table more or better, right?
And you could do that even if you're just saying limiting the state's interest to the second table, which neither of us would, but you could still get there in a certain way. And it's even there's so two things. You see this, and I mentioned this the other night on the Spaces. I've mentioned it seems like a million times now, but when you read, because this is something they're concerned about, blasphemy law cases that are American cases, the justification for upholding the enforcement by the court is always on the basis of civil order, of it's disruptive and bad for social cohesion when the majority religion is maligned publicly, and we're Christian people, therefore you have it's almost just a fact of life to them. It's not even really something to be debated. It's just their expectation for social order necessarily includes a religious element, because the people are religious. It is Christian, both historically and presently. Therefore, the civil order the temporal power has a civil interest in maintaining tranquility in that regard, which means you can't go around saying bad things openly about it. It's not an absolute restriction on speech and things, but it is a restriction. And there's a we could say purely civil interest being exerted there, which I'd be, I think you can go further, but I'd be perfectly happy with that argument, and think it's sufficient in many ways to do what we're talking about. But so I don't even, think Bill and Jenna have maybe familiar with that aspect or those categories and those sources. But that's the better conversation to have.
Yeah. And another key distinction is that we're not saying that the gospel as a sort of don't know. I was gonna say product of grace. I don't think that's not. That's fine. That's fine. As a sort of like, a product of grace. We're not saying that the gospel itself commands civil magistrates to be like its enforcement of the gospel itself. So we're not because like the gospel and its the spiritual administration of word and sacrament is deposited with the church and with established ministers. They're the ones who do all that. They're the ones who facilitate the worship of God. That they're the ones who offer the spiritual things of sacred and eternal life. But what we're saying is that the civil power can still operate out of this sort of natural power that it has. I'll say it's natural in the sense that it flows from their duty to the good of the people, and that good includes eternal or the highest good, right? So we're not saying that this is like a new command. We're not saying that. Yeah, we're saying this is an original old kind of duty of the civil power to order people in that way. So it's not like a new like adventitious command of God from the gospel. It's something in some ways I think you can say it's pre-gospel. It's natural, and then the application
of the thing,
So the application of grace that is the reason why they ought to promote and secure and support the true Christianity is because it's the true religion. Like that's their obligation as civil power is to promote the true religion, which is Christianity. So again, it's a natural principle. It's a natural power of civil government that's fulfilled in light of grace. That's how I've always explained it that way.
No, I think that's right, and I would say, I've said this other places, so I kind of like bore myself with it at this point, but it doesn't stick. But like, so if you're governing, and this gets to your point of it's just in the nature of the things and the nature of the office, which predates the full announcement of the gospel and the ministry of Christ. So it's just in the nature of the things. It's also not abrogated by the gospel either. So it's just there, just as much as like the nature of marriage isn't changed. These natural relations that also, as if you read older texts that we're interested in, they're always very quick, even in the 18th century too, to say you can these are truths when we're dealing with them at this level that good pagan governments will exercise. You will see them there, right? So this is just in the nature of the thing. My favorite is William Prynne on that, where he's just like, Nebuchadnezzar is doing everything right. He's just wrong about what religion is true, but his function is being performed appropriately when he deals with blasphemy and idolatry, and every well-ordered government does that. Now you just need to recognize the true religion because you have a duty to not promote idolatry and falsehood on your own at scale. And so you have to now pursue, that's where the duty to support the true religion, which is expressed in the church. You can't do it on your own because you don't have that office. So that's why you protect the church so it can do its mission. And it's good for society. It's good for civil order. But it also is incumbent upon you because you receive your power from God to be honorable to him by promoting only true things. So it all, kind of coheres and goes together. And I think it makes sense to me. It seems very simple. And I do agree. It's as I already said, it's just embedded in the nature of these things. You don't even, I think there are certain texts that are used over and over again in the tradition to talk about some of this, nursing fathers and mothers, what have you. But it's just a sort of metaphysical argument almost from these aspects. If given certain prior metaphysical realities, then, XYZ increasingly has to become the case. So if you begin with your anthropology and move on, you arrive at some of these conclusions that are also attested to in the tradition as well. So,
this is why you'll see Calvin, Turretin, Althusius, others. This is why they're appealing to Plato. So Plato's laws said that atheism should not be tolerated. Aristotle says there should be support for sacred offices, sacred buildings. Cicero talks about, I forget exactly what Cicero says, but something along the lines of supporting, religion. And all these guys are cited over and over. Even like Grotius cites them, and just over and over and over and over cited these guys. And why would they cite these people? Obviously there was no salvific grace with these pagan authors. The reason they cite those people is because they're operating out of something that's pre-grace, pre-political, or grace and pre-gospel. And then those principles that nature properly applied because of the gospel and because of Christianity's true religion ought to be for Christianity. So that's why I think it's weird when like the Two Kingdoms guys don't take an account of that argument. They want to talk about natural law, this and that.
Yeah.
Like, why is the tradition appealing to pagans? Well, because they're accessing the natural law that orders people to worship. So
I think I don't know if this is exactly true, but you see this in certain. I don't know if it's exactly true about contemporary treatment of the reformers on these questions, but you kind of see this in a lot of the historical work on the founders in the 18th century. We'll kind of treat it as it's almost to like diminish their intellect and things. It'll almost treat like the citations to classical sources as like window dressing, to just kind of say like it's almost convention. You kind of need to do it this way, instead of the fact that they were actually compelling and proved something and carried weight. And it was we were talking earlier about we're not able to have a conversation or debate with certain people about these things because we don't have a common bank of source material or common language intellectually. And the people still did in the 18th century. So you can this from reading, especially 17th century sources. Sometimes they're difficult because they'll make certain allusions to classical things, source material, whatever, that you're just expected to pick up on immediately. So their citations will be kind of meager, and you've really got to track them down and make sure you know what they're referring to and like how they're using it, because it was just so common. It's almost like rudimentary. And even as some of, for our purposes, those same sources will be, I'm trying to think of a good one that's really terse at the beginning. It's not Vermeille. He does a good job. Anyway, some of them will be so terse at the beginning that you feel like you're missing something. It's probably because they don't want to waste their time on things that everybody should just know. So you can just dive right into the deep end, right? And get something going. Some of the election sermons, you'll see this, just things stated summarily. And it's because no one would have disagreed with it. And it's just getting you up to speed of like where we're going to go. Anyway.
Yeah. On the election sermon, I think, and you've probably read it. There's, I think it's Davenport did an election sermon. And it's essentially like
or 71, 1670 or 71, I think is his.
Of course, you know this. But I mean, I remember that it was I was reading like Rutherford's Lex Rex, and then I read that sermon for my dissertation or something like that.
Yeah,
and I was like, wow, that's like he's like quoting, without attribution, he's quoting Rutherford. Right. So So. I mean, that's probably plagiarism more than anything.
Right. I was 69. Okay, so I was close.
Yeah, it was a good one. I used it because it has natural law in it and all that. Like, so it's good.
It's a really
for
good
my project. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's very good. I think I've commended that to people elsewhere. I mean, I like Davenport a lot, even though he. He plagiarized a lot of stuff because he steals, who knows if he wrote it or Cotton wrote it on the the discourse, right? That was like our first argument on a podcast was about
this is like inside baseball now, but
anyway, sorry.
That goes back to the old days. The days that are now past. Those
yes.
So the world no longer exists, unfortunately.
It doesn't. Just arguing over
elections. And nobody can deny that the Puritans did some of these things when they first colonized the United States of America. And we make the distinction between those who initially colonized the United States of America and what actually became our United States Constitution. And let me give you an example of what this looks like.
Discontinuity between
when you're there, you have this statue of a woman named Mary Dyer. And Mary Dyer was a woman who came over as a Puritan, but she would go back and forth between the United States and England. And while she was away at one point in time, she converted to Quakerism. And if you know anything about the relationship between Quakers and Puritans, they didn't get along because they differed over things such as divine special revelation, as it relates to almost like a charismatic concept of divine revelation given to them, over the ordination of women, over a variety of different things. Well, Mary came back to Boston and she started hosting Quaker meetings. And during this time, Mary actually became pregnant
wearing
and
clothes in
she
public.
miscarried the child. And these Puritans were saying to her, well, you miscarried the child because of your conversion to Quakerism. And they ended up passing all of these laws banning Quakerism. And she was hung in the Boston Commons for being a Quaker. And she's gone down as a hallmark now of what it really means to have religious freedom in the United States of America. So when we look at this,
so there are the myths of what of 17th century New England Puritanism are just astounding. And and so part of my dissertation was partly on this. So I'm an expert. Yes. No, but what's interesting is like the Puritans were dealing with these sort of claims even back then. Like there was a pattern. So there was like there was like Roger Williams, Antinomians, then Quakers. I mean Quakers all the time, and then eventually the Baptist issue kind of came to a head in like the late 60s and early 70s and all that. In each case, what's interesting is like in each case there's a pattern. Like there's a pattern overall. It's that the New England authorities suppress this dissidents in some fashion. They go back to England, write a book, and then that book is circulated, and everyone's like, "Whoa, look what New England's! This is crazy. These people are persecuting, blah blah blah." And then you have the New England authorities saying, "No, that's not what happened at all." It happened over and over. So first with the Antinomians, John Winthrop did this. He wrote something called a short story, or I forget what the title is. He did that. He responded to this because he was. And then of course there was Cotton responding to Roger Williams before that. And then later on, you have with the Baptists, you have once all the controversy with the Baptists kind of came to a head, or climax, I guess. You had my boy Samuel Willard writing a piece that explained what happened, and with Increase Mather writing a preface. So this pattern happened over and over, and it's like the claims of the quote persecuted are the ones that won out, and and then created these myths that we have today instead of actually dealing with what actually happened on the ground. So
right. Well, we have to get the title right on Winthrop. It's a short story of the rise, reign, and ruin of the Antinomians.
Okay, there you go. Yeah,
and the Libertine and the Familist.
There it is.
Anyway,
there it is.
I mean, this is actually why it's part of the story of why they lose their original charter when Charles II comes back, because when he gets back, there's probably ulterior motives for Charles to do this at the time. Dealing with the wars with the Dutch and debt and everything, but something he has like on his desk, essentially, we can think of it that way. When he comes back into Whitehall, is like on his desk is this, very fantastical account by Quakers published in London of what's happening. And he's like, oh my goodness, this has to, and the Quakers are a convenient constituency for him, of course. So he says, I'm going to give we've got to put a stop to this. It's against the new laws at the time of England and all. So it gets them and then they end up losing, we have consolidation of the colonies, whatever, and an actual tyrannical situation. But with the Quakers too, I mean, if we want to be accurate, you and I probably talked about this before publicly somewhere, I can't remember, but like I'm pretty hard on the Quakers, and I don't have a lot of sympathy for 17th century Quakers in these scenarios because, we think of them as they were nuts. Yeah. So, I mean, so was Roger Williams. They're like all these guys are kind of nuts. And they did things. So it's not just that they're nutty, and it's not really the theological issues. I mean, you had a great quote you were sharing with me the other day from John Cotton talking about, the essentially the myth of how they think of religious liberty in Massachusetts Bay at the time. He's like, that's not what we do. We're not persecuting belief. We're not terrorizing people. We're not doing any of that. Like people don't have to be, we're not forcing them into church. Like we're not doing that in this way. So, but the point is like the Quakers were there, and there's writings from them on this to make like an intentional spectacle, right? They come to Massachusetts Bay essentially as missionaries. That's how they see themselves. And they're coming back, they'll come through Rhode Island, then up once Rhode Island's established, up to Massachusetts, into Boston. And part of their missionary approach is to essentially wreak havoc by they're of course going to intentionally violate the laws against preaching certain things in public, but they also would like spit on the ministers and the magistrates, and they would like disrupt church services naked and like throw, I think there was one case where they were throwing broken bottles at like the preacher and all this stuff. And so eventually the magistrates are kind of like, well, I mean, you can chalk it up to essentially just the civil order argument we made earlier of like, you cannot have this. It's very
Well, yeah.
disruptive and the people don't want it. Right.
Yeah. And I think that there's I think Samuel Sowell has a
Yeah.
diary, you know, he has the diaries, the 2-volume diary you can pick up. There's an entry of a Quaker woman who rushes into the church naked in blackface. Okay. She's nude with blackface, babbling and screaming and calling everyone heretics and and so there's more to it than this. So like the way Bill approaches it, it's like, oh, she showed up and she was just a humble little woman who and who was just doing a Bible study, and they pulled her out and they hung her and killed her. Okay.
Right.
But to understand what the Quakers is when they finally did hang, I think they hang like 2 or maybe 3 or 4 of them. They let some others go. Yeah. And she was one of them. But these people were banished like 3 or 4 times back to England.
Oh, that's right. That's right.
Before they actually. So basically, the New England would say, "You guys are nuts. You're crazy. You're disruptive. You're awful. You're getting on that ship. You're going back." 3 months later or whatever, they'd come back and they do the same thing over again. They put them on the ship, send them back, or they go down to Virginia. Or other colonies, those colonies be like, get that out of here. Right. Then they leave there, you know, and they come back to New England. And it's like, what are you people doing? And so in the end, they did pass a law. After like the 3rd or 4th time, they're like, okay, if you come back, we're going to kill you. We're going to execute you. And then there was, I think it was like the 2nd or 3rd time, then they passed the law, and then a bunch of people came back and they said, okay, we'll be lenient. We won't apply the law to you. If you come back again, we're going to apply the law to you. Sure enough, they come back and do their same nonsense again. And so it's like, I get, like, it looks like it's religious liberty persecution, but that's not what happened. Like it's like nuts who are crazy and won't take a hint, and then they just said, and maybe in the end, like, you know, executing was wrong, but it's not simply this narrative of this humble woman shows up with a Bible study and has her kid, and oh, how dare you be Quaker, we're gonna kill you. Like, that's not at all what happened. And none of that even happened. That didn't happen with Roger Williams. That didn't happen with the Antinomians. It didn't happen with the Baptists. Each of those stories is unique. But still, none of that narrative of like the Puritans breaking down the door of these humble, you know, law-abiding people. None of those narratives are actually accurate.
I mean, there's pretty good evidence that the Puritans throughout their control of Massachusetts were aware that, you know, in the western part of the colony, especially, you know, that there were antinomians, Anabaptist, Quakers, and even witches running around, not bothering anybody. Like, they were out there, and it was fine. You know, they're not marching around to go find a heathen to kill just because that they like doing that sort of thing.
Yeah, if I may just like cite a source for that, like John Cotton says that. Maybe you're about to. I just stole your thunder.
No.
John Cotton says that explicitly. It's like, hey, so we control like Boston and Salem and these other places. But we don't. Yeah, like he's like, we don't go out and go find a bunch of heretics in the woods and round them up. This was part of the appeal of the Baptists. It's like, okay, the Congregationalists are like, okay, we left, we came here, we established a sort of civil order that with our church state relations, it was our intent. You come here, we will receive you if you conform to our church state relations. Don't bother us. Don't start your own churches. You can be part of our churches, which like that was, they were accepted, as you know, they were accepted into churches as long as they would not be crazy. And then when when Increase Mather and Willard write this reply, they're like, why did you come here? Like, if it would be wrong, like the Congregationalists are like saying it would be wrong of us to say, oh, there's this Baptist colony down in, I don't know, wherever. Let's go there and become our Congregationalists and disrupt and this and that. They'd be like, why? Like, that would be wrong for us to do. Why are you doing that here? And if you want to go found your own anti-Paedo Baptist colony, then go right ahead and go ahead and do it. We're not going to bother you. We're not going to start an army and say, let's go drown the Baptists. Like,
right.
So anyway,
right. Yeah. Which is, no, it's frustrating because I mean, one thing if it was just like a nerdy interest we had, but it does get trotted out all the time, like pretty frequently in these debates we've been having today over the past couple of years. It does get trotted out a lot. So, and it's trading on the same myths that have been, if people do the reading, have been refuted not only by the primary sources themselves at the time, but then you could check those and say, okay, was that actually true, or is this pure polemics? And it's been demonstrated. I mean, I think another one is, I think it is your boy, Samuel Willard, who writes to the Anabaptist. I've cited this one before, for like, they're complaining, this colony is supposed to be for religious liberty and you won't give us the full franchise. And they were like, what are you talking about? Like, we're here to, like, that's really weird to say. Like, you can go do that somewhere else. There's plenty of land, but we're doing it here. We've been doing it a while. We're pretty successful. We want it to be this way. We welcome anybody who will join in with like our type of society. And if you don't want to, then you go somewhere else, but please don't bother us. I mean, I think, and to show that they weren't just, heartless kind of bloodthirsty guys. I mean, I think Winthrop is the one who warns Williams when they're going to send him to London. They're going to send him back, put him on a ship. And, he had all these connections in London anyway. And I think Winthrop is like, writes him and says, hey, we're getting ready to send you back to London. So if you don't want that to happen, like, you could just go down to what's now Rhode Island and hang out there, and you'll be out of the jurisdiction, and you could do that. And that's what he did. So it's, it was kind of like, as the governor at the time was like, we can do two things. You can leave one of two ways and, knock yourself out. Anyway, the point is, it's always more complicated. And so just using it the way Bill Roach does here is kind of a joke. And then to also make, we can get into this too, the continuity, discontinuity thing of, is it so as if you transported a whole new people unconditioned by the previous 150 years into 1776. And then, by 87, 89, boom, here's your constitutional order with no background, no influence, even though, again, if you do the reading, like one of Samuel Adams's favorite pen names is, Sudes, is like to say is the first Anon account in America. He had like 25 different names, was the Puritan, right? And he was very proud of like his Puritan heritage. He famously calls Boston a Christian Sparta, or that's what he wants it to be. He thinks there's massive continuity, and that's part of the reason he is then an anti-federalist and sort of contrary to John Adams, sides more with that positioning than the Federalist positioning at the time. So but to him, it's a certain consciousness he carried. And by the way, he called himself the Puritan because his contemporaries called him the last Puritan. Like, he was known to be religiously zealous, for his heritage. It's not just a religion. He's very orthodox, it seems, but it's not just that. Like, he's very proud of his parents and things. So it's like there's extreme continuity, and they think they're defending a way of life that predates, what they then established, and that's the whole point. So it's really weird to say there's this, history starts over. It's like a grand reset, and has nothing to do with, our founders would have been super embarrassed by Massachusetts in the 1660s. It's like, well, no, they kind of thought it was, they kind of wanted to preserve a lot of it. So I don't know.
Yeah. And I mean, I think he recognized that he kind of has to do that, make that move,
right.
Because because he wants to say that we want to jump back into the 17th century New England, and that violates the founding principles, because there's an utter break. Another thing I wanted to mention is Cotton Mather. So Cotton Mather is he's writing in like around 1701. What is it, Magnalia Christiana, to that kind of history of New England. He has a section on persecution. He's kind of famous for somewhat repudiating some of the past, actions against people, and he thought they were unnecessary. He didn't like how they treated the Baptists, except he thought that the way they treated the Quakers was justified. Like, he actually says they were nuts. I mean, pretty much. And he says that, he said, I'll defend my forefathers all day long when it comes to the Quakers. And so that's from Cotton Mather, who was kind of a bridge builder with the Baptists as well, in his own, about 15 years later.
Yeah.
So
No, that's right.
Anyway, but I
Yeah.
think I think Cotton Mather's like I use him, you know, in my dissertation. I think Cotton Mather is kind of the sort of bridge in a way, perhaps,
Yeah.
or he's indicative of a move towards greater religious toleration towards the Baptists, and
Yeah.
so I think there's continuity. I've argued that many times, and
Mhm.
and I think and our friends are also on that side. And but yeah, I mean we can.
Yeah.
I think they'll get
No,
to the
that's
founding, so we can move on. We can keep going.
okay. Yeah,
Unless you
yeah.
have something else.
No, I was just I echo the point on Mather, on Cotton Mather. I wrote something a little while ago, just only looking at his. So I didn't bring in the Magnalia, but the just some of his public sermons that are like more political. So they're all to general assemblies for various reasons. And you can even from that construct that same narrative you're talking about. I mean, I basically say he's kind of the first American in this regard because he paints a vision of the pan-Protestant union that you kind of have, and that's what I think he wanted. He talks about it explicitly. It is more of this toleration for Protestants. It comes out of this, you know, that United Brethren kind of effort overseas that was before that he was really him and Increase were fans of. They're making sense of like the new charter, all this stuff. So he preaches on this over and over again. I think it's 4 or 5 times. And he is, you know, post 1689 is like going that direction with everybody and kind of pushing it there, and saying like we can agree on the. But again, that'll get us to later religious liberty stuff of like the scope of that and that sort of thing. Where I think there's extreme continuity to what you're saying and what you get at the founding, which is, you know, not that much longer later. Like, you know, Cotton Mather knew Ben Franklin, so it's not. Like it's pretty tight timeline. So to say there's no continuity would be strange just on its face, but I think you do have it in this regard. And I think that's fair to say singularly that Cotton Mather, as you put it, sort of bridge. I think that's right. That makes sense to me.
Okay. Yeah, I love to read those sermons. I'm not aware of those, but that's good. You should put that on.
I'll have to get it on the resources. Yeah. I wrote a really long
resourcement project.
I wrote a really long piece in American Former called "Why Cotton Mather," was like talking about our fellowship name, and that's where I do this breakdown of these sermons. But I need to put them out so everyone can just read them. I do a pretty long breakdown of them. It might be like 8,000 words or something, but anyway, people can go bore themselves with that.
All right. Well, let's
do more, Bill.
This. We've done like 8 minutes, but that's fine. I mean, I can talk as long as if you get tired and want to go away, we can just shut it off whenever.
Yeah.
When we see sort of the Puritan ideal put on the American soil, it led to the death of people like Mary Dyer. So regardless of what kind of definition they want to give, we know what they're actually doing with the Christian nationalism. They're enforcing these blasphemy laws from the state in an integralist sense to silence those who oppose them. So in that sense, it's a denial of freedom of speech and the freedom of religion.
Mm-hmm. And this is why I think, Bill.
All right. Do you want to talk about this now then?
Well, yeah. I mean, we kind of already did with like the rationale for blasphemy laws, or.
But I think let's deal with like you know the constitutional history better than anyone, right? So on blasphemy laws,
better than anyone, I don't know.
Yeah, better than anyone. But well, I guess probably more than anyone listening. So let's just you can play it off as the.
What do we have? Yeah.
But I mean, but as everyone kind of knows, as everyone should know, that there were blasphemy laws in this country for you know, in different counties and states across the country for many years, for decades, centuries, even I think today there are blasphemy laws just not enforced. I don't remember. I think there was a court case in the 1920s that affirmed them. But this is maybe you know all these things. But the fact of the matter is like the idea. Yeah. Let's before we get specifically blasphemy laws, we should point out, like, you know, it's people say this all the time, is that there were I call them soft establishments in the founding era and beyond. That even Roger Sherman, people don't know him, but he was one of the he helped craft the First Amendment, which includes religion causes, and he was responsible with another guy to kind of revise the Connecticut state code or the law, the laws. And in that included the civil support for, I mean, it recognized the right of conscience, but also that there ought to be some kind of civil support for religion. And there was that condition that if you can peaceably assemble for your worship, as long as you're peaceful, that sort of proviso you see all the time. So there were people within, I mean, he's just one example. That Bill almost wants to take like the Madisonian approach, which I think would be, which was the minority position at the time, which was an utter separation. And people have commented how Madison's view went even farther than Locke's. Like Locke said, atheists and Roman Catholics shouldn't be tolerated. Madison's just like, yeah, everyone.
Right.
Whereas, or not just toleration, but also a strict separation. Whereas people like George Washington, George Mason, John Adams, Roger Sherman, even like these people would say that you need to have, it's good to have some kind of civil involvement in religion in a positive way, that is providing money to religious to churches and ministers. That's So, anyway.
Yeah, it's like interesting when you're talking about the scope of some of these things of religious liberty and toleration at the founding, like I think the loosest of the original state constitutions on this point is probably New York in 77. I think they are, where they have an article, a paragraph on the right of conscience, and then they don't have one for establishment, right? They don't have, I mean, New York's always been like the most cosmopolitan. It's changed from Dutch to British hands and all this stuff. So you have it's very much a religious melting pot to some degree already. But they do have an article then right after that's all on why specifically it says ministers of the gospel. It doesn't just say like anybody who thinks they're, they went online and they can like perform weddings now. It's like a minister of the gospel should not simultaneously serve in religious and civil office because it will obstruct or distract from the ministry of God to the people for their religious good, something like that. And so the point is, you don't have an establishment in that state, although a lot of other ones you did, and you are introducing there a bit of a set. That was not an uncommon, as you know, in colonial America. I mean, the Puritans actually had a law saying you couldn't do this either, be a clergy and serve in the legislature. But they're doing that. But it's the scope of it is obviously Christianity, minister of the gospel. It's de facto Protestant, and the separation that's introduced is justified on the basis that it would that really the ministry of the gospel is higher than that of the civil, right? Which is so it's a law that, for the preservation of the church is why it's produced, of the churches.
Yeah.
So you have that, that's the most liberal really of the time. I mean, you have all these tests for offices, even Tennessee's original constitution, which is afterwards, there's no establishment, but they still have religious tests for offices that are all Christian, explicitly Christian, Trinitarian, all this. So we all know that. I mean, all the state constitutional data that paints a very different picture. It tells you a lot. There are consensus documents, like what's going on the ground. So we don't even have to like line up all the founders of like the names we know. We know that Jefferson and Madison and Thomas Paine, of course, are outliers. Historians say this. This is not just like our assessment. It's very obvious. They're total outliers. But then on top of that, you can look at more, you could call it like social history data or something, which constitutions are better examples of what's going on the ground, like what's life like at the time socially. And what do most people kind of think? What are they okay with? What are they? And those state constitutions do that for you. They show you what the general consensus opinion is at the time. There's some diversity, but it's generally towards certainly, establishmentarian principles, even if some of it's more soft, like you're saying, or more diversified. Once again, the Quakers basically had an establishment because they were like politically active at one time. They controlled Philadelphia. So all of this conflicts with this simple narrative of separations introduced. And, it's not really Jenna and Bill's fault, I guess, because even see this in like Supreme Court cases, they cite the remonstrance, they cite, something from Virginia and maybe a letter or two, and then boom, there's your narrative.
Yeah, I mean, Mark
so-
David Hall, who's a essentially historian. I guess he's technically a political theorist, but
yeah,
he's demonstrated that the Supreme Court has cited really what would be like the minority positions to justify
mhm,
the interpretation of the Constitution. Even citing like
yeah,
Jefferson, who wasn't even there when the First Amendment was
yeah,
crafted and
yeah,
ratified.
yeah,
Like, oh, this is the interpretation
right,
the proper, even though he wasn't there. And
yeah,
again, it's easy to demonstrate that both Madison, Jefferson, Thomas Paine had the minority
mhm,
position
mhm,
at the time, just among the founders. But what you said, institutionally,
mhm,
that's indicative of
yeah,
contrary view as well. So, but like
yeah,
when they say Constitution and freedom of religion, they're talking about the First Amendment. And as I like
mhm.
to always point out, like, well, what's the first word of the First Amendment? Which is Congress.
Would you do the poll that was
Oh, I
like
did the poll. I didn't
Congress or
post
I've
it.
never read it?
Yeah. Yeah. And so they assume like, oh, well, of course, like you can't, that's
Mhm,
anti-establishmentarian. And so therefore that
mhm,
is the governing principle in every state, every local
yeah,
jurisdiction. But of course
yeah,
that wasn't the case. It
yeah,
wasn't the case in
yeah,
practice. It wasn't the case in theory at the
yeah.
time. And I think, what's his name? Munez, you know, that guy,
Munoz from
Munoz.
Notre Dame. Yeah,
I mean,
really
he's
good.
basically demonstrated what was, I think, fairly obvious, that
Mhm,
the purpose of the First Amendment was not what was more to restrain Congress so that the states could do their job. I think
yeah,
I hope I
exactly right.
haven't understood his
No,
argument, but
that his
whenever,
it's on the First Amendment, or it's on the religious clauses generally, so not just the Establishment Clause. And he uses in the book, I think he solely draws from ratification debates, so that's like his
Mhm.
world, right, that he's going
Yeah,
to
that's
work
right.
in
Yep.
to keep
Mhm.
it tight. And what he just shows from those debates is one on the religious clauses, the two free exercise establishment clause. There's comparatively very little debate over than because so much is agreed upon.
Mhm.
There's not much reason to. But the one thing that is obvious is that no one would have signed on to it if you had disrupted the state establishments, and that really cut across both Federalist and anti-Federalist positions. Like it was
Mhm.
not a divide, but especially the anti-Federalist, right? Who they were especially concerned of a bloated national government generally that might encroach, and so it's a maintenance of denominational at the state level distinctions and the status quo essentially. I mean, especially the New England guys, of course. And you see the same recognition if you want, like, if people want a good source, I think, for a sort of an observation that's contemporary to the time. You find it in stuff like Joseph Story, right, who's writing towards
Mhm.
the end of a lot of these establishments. But
Yeah.
there's a reason he begins the commentaries on a chapter by chapter history of all the colonies. So he does that first, the first book, just history of all the colonies, one by one. And then he goes into describing like the Constitution that springs out of those people, right? And then his chapter on the First Amendment, the religious clauses generally, he affirms what Munoz is saying, and kind of gives three versions of establishment that might all have some kind of purchase in the colonies and the original states at the time. But that's the leading jurist at the time. It's a better source than Thomas Jefferson
Yeah.
in that regard. So anyway, it's all this stuff is easily demonstrated and has been by Munoz is good. I always point people to the book by Max Edling, which is called Perfecting the Union. It's much shorter. I think he's actually a Dutch guy, but he kind of takes this position that the real point is what's the difference between the Articles of Confederation and the Federal Constitution. So the scope is a little bit bigger, but his chapter on like the internal police powers and domestic policing powers of the states that are inherited through the charters, those couple of chapters are excellent on this point of where he's saying, you see James Wilson, Ben Franklin, and several other Federalists like combing the country after the Constitution's when it's trying to be ratified to assure all of them that they're not going to encroach on these state like prerogatives, which includes religion, and that like it does not touch it. The First Amendment Establishment Clause does nothing to disrupt what you already have. And Edling makes the point that if they had not done that and worked really hard, there's like several James Wilson speeches on it, you never would have got it off the ground.
Huh.
Anyway, these are historians that have no interest. Mark David Hall has some interest in this debate ongoing now, but generally historians, Munoz doesn't have any interest in what the argument we're having in like evangelicalism, but they've disproven these points. So please do the reading, and then you can come engage with the discussion, because we're having to like retread, the ground that's already been taken care of. Like, don't reinvent the wheel over and over. If the history has been established, then just run with it and make your case. So very frustrated. I get frustrated with that, but anyway.
So I mean, so read those books, and I think Mark David Hall's book, which is,
and he wrote a good book on Sherman too, right? Didn't he write a book?
He wrote Roger Sherman's Political Theory. I think that's probably more academic, but
that was a good book.
But I think, but his book on like, was America founded as a Christian nation? It was one of those question books. There's like 10 different books with that a similar version of that question. So whatever, Mark David Hall, you'll find it. Yeah, his is like similar. So another thing, so if you guys, whoever listening, if anyone's out there listening, so you got Joseph Story. You can literally search Joseph Story and then First Amendment, speech and press, and boom. So I have it right here. Like the first line here, so he's talking about freedom of speech clause. He says that this amendment was intended to secure to every citizen an absolute right to speak or write or print whatever he might please, without any responsibility, public or private, therefore, is a supposition too wild to be indulged by any rational man. This would be to allow to every citizen a right to destroy at his pleasure the reputation, the peace, the property, and even the personal safety of every other citizen. A man might, out of mere malice and revenge, accuse another of the most infamous crimes, might excite against him the indignation of his fellow citizens. He goes on and on. He basically says that like the idea that this is absolute right. And I know that there's obviously development, but I mean, even like Supreme Court today doesn't say there's an absolute right, but he's clearly has this the idea that speech is not an end in itself, but actually a means to. There's a purpose behind it. It's not simply just you can't say F the draft on a T-shirt and call that speech. Like pornography is not speech. So like
Well, he goes on to say somewhere, it's probably on down on the religion clauses in particular, and I think it should be the free exercise clause he's talking about. And he has this great line. I've probably used it before somewhere, where it's like, paraphrasing, the First Amendment is in no regard meant to prostrate Christianity before Islam. He says like Mohammedanism, or whatever the guys back then said, or lists several others, and is like, this is not the point. It's not to equalize or level the playing field amongst all religions. It was meant to what we've been talking about is establish a certain kind of polity that's full of Christians, mainly Protestants. And then that's when he goes into the three various models and kind of tells you which one the country at the state level was endorsing, essentially at the time of varying degrees of establishment. And you have in there this sort of pan-Protestantism that we've already talked about is he's clearly recognizing. And you get another great source that I've cited many times that's much later. So if you want to see like continuity, you can go to another Supreme Court Justice, David Brewer's United States, a Christian Nation, which is just a few series of lectures. You can read it in like an hour, and he makes the same kind of arguments. And that's in the 1920s. That he gave the lectures at like Swarthmore or something like that, or Haverford maybe. So the same thing. That's from the 1920s. You still have Sabbath laws being enforced at that time. I think the last blasphemy case was like this would make sense because you have establishments being eroded slightly in the 1830s. It's going to be in like the late 1830s or late 1840s would be the last blasphemy case, I think. But there's
I thought there was one that was.
I think that's right at the state level.
Later.
I think it's Massachusetts. But there could be. I may just be forgetting. Definitely, you have Sabbath laws throughout the 1920s, 30s, on up. Those go for quite a while. But there's a great article out there that might be 2 years old or maybe only a year old. That was in Harvard Law Journal. It's it's something like the original meaning of the First Amendment and blasphemy, law of speech, all this sort of thing. It's a great article. People.
So actually, let me read from that article, if I may.
I can't remember the author's name, but it's really good.
Yeah, I'm looking at it right now. So until well into the 20th century, American law recognized blasphemy as prescribable speech. The black letter rule was clear. Constitutional liberty entailed the right to articulate views on religion, but not a right to commit blasphemy, the offense of, quote, malicious reviling God, which encompassed, quote, profane ridicule of Christ. The English common law had punished blasphemy as a crime while excluding, quote, disputes between learned men upon particular controverted points from the scope of criminal blasphemy. Looking at this precedent, 19th century American appellate courts consistently upheld prescriptions on blasphemy, drawing a line between punishable blasphemy and protected religious speech. At the close of the 19th century, the U.S. Supreme Court still assumed that the First Amendment did not permit the publication of blasphemous articles. And in 1921, the Maine Supreme Court, Supreme Judicial Court affirmed a blasphemy conviction under the state's First Amendment. Even on the eve of American entry into World War II, the 10th Circuit upheld an anti-blasphemy ordinance against a facial first, I don't know what that means. You probably know that, but First Amendment challenge, I don't know what that means. Only in the post-war period did the doctrine promulgated by appellate courts begin to shift. So that article pretty much says that, yeah, it was well accepted as, or it was accepted generally at least. And then it wasn't until after World War II that things began to shift, which is precisely what we've all kind of said for.
Yeah. I forgot about the main one. That's great. Because I remember it's Commonwealth versus like Neeland or something is the one in Massachusetts that they uphold like a jailing for blasphemy. And after that, that's the last one in Massachusetts. I forgot. That's great. The main one is in the 20s. So anyway, and then the Sabbath laws are doing the same thing through the same period.
Yeah. So so the point is that like most of these people, when they think of religious liberty, freedom of speech, they might think like I think it's oh, you're gonna be, I should have got a beer.
Well, yeah, but once we got into the Quakers, I'd forgotten I had it sitting here, but
I was like, man, I need to smoke. So I can't smoke in here, unfortunately. I guess I could.
You need to get a system.
Yes. But my boys' room is literally right there, so I don't know if I could. Where was I? Oh, so the point being is that like these guys, they take their understanding from essentially post-war era. And it's these conservative myths that we've all heard since we were a kid, and boomers have heard their entire lives. And it's just myths that like Reagan perpetuated, all these things about that religious liberty, freedom of speech, all that stuff that were not true. And then people just forgot, like mainly they don't have the memory of these things. They don't have memory of prayer in schools. They don't have memory of this sort of thing. And so it seems so utterly foreign. And then it's easy to kind of transmit that narrative into all of our understanding of history. And so like we haven't gotten there yet, but they'll start talking about the American experiment. When in reality, like the experiment you're talking about is the constitutional order of the post-war era. Like literally when they speak of America, they're speaking of what you might call a second founding. I know some people want to say third, but a second, or maybe people say fourth. I don't know.
Second. Yeah.
The latest founding, the most latest founding, which would be kind of from the 60s onward.
Yeah.
That's the America they're talking about. Whereas like you and I, when we talk about American Christian nationalism or kind of American political order, to use that terminology, we mean something prior to that era. And which is the majority history of America. So it's always weird for me to be called un-American when like my ideas are literally just more common in American history than their ideas, which is actually very recent. So
yes.
Should we move on?
Yeah, let's
keep this rolling.
Since we're just beating up.
It's so important that we do look back at history because while we as Christians, of course, are rejecting what
agree.
the secularists would espouse that Jefferson meant by the separation of church and state, that Christians can't even engage government, that civil government has a no objective moral truth at its foundation, that ultimately is the measurable difference between what we criminalize and prohibit versus what is permissible in society. What is that difference between mala inse versus mala prohibitum? This concept in law that certain things are just inherently evil, and then some things just for the good and well-ordered establishment of society, then we have to have those prohibited just to have a moral and upright society. So we tend to, as Christians, uniformly understand that it's a leftist proposition, this separation of church and state. But what's fascinating about the Christian nationalist position is that when they talk about separation of church and state, they're actually coming at it from the right. And they're suggesting that integralism means that we don't have a separation of church and state. Jefferson was wrong because he was a deist, and we have to have this integral type of cohesive philosophy.
I mean, she's just like
that
making
our founders
stuff up.
fundamentally
I'm not even
understood
sure.
in
I don't
context in
understand
their moment in history.
Just
And they
words.
expressly
Well, it's just like making some. I don't know. I maybe someone has said that. Oh, he was a deist. I mean, maybe someone has said that. I've never said that.
I always say it was a bad deist because he believed in like the intervention of providence and things, which means you're not. But
yeah,
that's
again,
not
like
why he would be. Well, first of all, she's not representing. I don't know. She's oscillating between being descriptive and prescriptive, so it's a little confusing. But she's not representing Jefferson or the people she's saying represent correctly. But even then, I wouldn't say Jefferson's wrong because he's a deist. Just like I wouldn't say I want blasphemy laws so I can shut down people that disagree with me, which he said, or Roach said earlier. So it's like these kind of motives, or I guess biases, maybe it's projection. It's not because he's a deist. There are other. I mean, I get annoyed at that category applied to that period, but that's a different thing. But I think it's kind of sloppy, and it's a bit of a psyop and a myth. But anyway. Someone who's imperfectly orthodox, we can say for sure. Like you wouldn't want him to teach in your Sunday school class, probably. And there's not a reason to disqualify. You have a lot of people at the time that would fit that mold. Not as many as it would fit an Orthodox Christian mold, but some of them. It's not. No one's saying that, and no one is saying that. Well, I guess she was describing the left. It would say Christians can't even be involved in society. I don't know who's saying that.
I don't know.
Anyway.
We could keep going. Maybe we cut her off halfway through her reasoning.
Anyway,
but,
yeah.
I would just say too, like,
following.
I mean, so John Adams is an interesting case because he was anti-Trinitarian, but he supported, these these state establishments. So I don't know what like their heresy or heterodox views have to do, but anyway, whatever. Maybe we're just being too picky on her. Thing here. That's not fair.
They rejected, so that we had two different spheres of authority under God, which is the civil government and the church government, and it wasn't integral.
I mean, we've talked about this already.
Exactly. That's so much of what we see here is that there's this strong return to the idea of the compulsion of religion within this Christian nationalist movement. And what they're doing with it is that you'll find a lot of them. And again, it's a broad movement and there's a lot of zeal with it, is when you look at these sort of thought terminating cliches that they're giving, either, Christ or chaos. And if you don't sort of have the fully orbed, all of the aspects of God's divine revelation written into American law, then you can't have any ethical aspects given to society. And I go, first of all, just looking at the argument, that's a false bifurcation. It's not either this or that. And people might be thinking, well, what's in the middle of this? Or what's another alternative? And I go, the natural law tradition that we have throughout Western society.
The natural law tradition.
I can still legislate morality because if it's true that all of us are made in the image of God and we have these self-evident principles of morality that are given to all people at all times in all places, I can legislate the moral law because it's something that exists outside of all of us, because it's something that God has given as a feature to all of humanity, and it's something that resides inside all of us because he gave us not only a law, but a conscience. And that's so much of what the American founders realized, that we have these self-evident truths.
Okay, so what law? I think they go on to talk about law of nature, nature's God. I always find, I don't know if we mentioned this already, but I always find this so weird. It's like they think the natural law is nothing but a set of like ethical commands in relation to man, and it
Yeah.
never dawns on them that like no, like natural law, the chief part of it, like the principal part.
Yeah.
I mean the part from which all the rest flow
Yeah.
is, worship the true God, right? I mean,
Mhm.
so it's
Mhm.
like literally we were born for we were created to do a lot of things, but the principal thing and the highest thing we can do as
Mhm.
rational beings, as beings under a moral law, is to acknowledge and worship God.
Mhm.
So it's always weird to hear people talk about the law of nature as if somehow that's like an atheistic. It's as if we can cut off like the
Yeah.
lawgiver from that law, and it's just a matter of how I relate to fellow man.
Mhm. Mhm.
So it's like you want to legislate the moral law. It's like, okay, then ban atheism, ban
Right.
polytheism,
Right.
ban like profanation of Sabbath, ban dishonoring of God, ban vain or profane rights. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the moral law, and that's the first
Right.
chief part of the moral law. So anyway, it's
No, that's
whatever
no,
you
that's a
try.
good. That's exactly right. I mean, I think I mean, yeah, that was a good. It's a good point to make. I think the thing that he's mainly driving at, and I mean, I'm so tired of this, and it's just been thrown around over and over, is the theonomic, accusation. No one's saying that I've noticed in our circles. I mean, there's theonomists that we'd be friendly with. I'm friendly with theonomists, and they're fine people. But I don't. I've made clear I don't share their position. You've made that clear in terms of the application of the law, at least. And as if you have. I mean, I think he literally just said the whole Bible, though, which would be odd. That you'd need to legislate the whole Bible into existence. But certainly not the Old Testament civil law. But at the same time, with this sort of this thing he's wanting to set, this bifurcation between modes of revelation he's wanting to set up between Scripture and then the atheistic moral laws you're talking about, that you've already addressed the issue with God there. The other thing is, if you again do the reading, especially 17th century, and this is even the case in the 18th century. It's certainly the case in 17th century, like common law cases. Is I think the bifurcation of the two modes of revelation are not nearly as stark as we even Christians, even people that be on our side in this debate, would make them today. I think it's much more fluid and kind of acceptable to when you cite Scripture in a case at the common law bench, you're not a theonomist, and it's also true that when you're citing just something from reason or the tradition, you're not denying that Scripture could be cited for the same thing. Like, of course, all this should cohere, especially if the natural law in miniature is republished in the Decalogue. Like, everything just kind of, you build on it and stack upon it, and you can, you'll sort of see this in the methodology of 17th century sources of like they'll begin with one of the pagans, and then they'll go to maybe a medieval source, and then you'll go to maybe a newer scholastic source, and then you'll pull in Scripture as well, or some kind of order like that. And so you build your case with your source material, and ultimately they're all agreeable. That's the whole point. So I don't know. I just get tired with that kind of argument being made. But the simplest retort of that is what you already said to them, which I think is key. That great, let's do the moral law, but you're not going to like the results.
Yeah, isn't odd to, I mean, it's one thing. So I think it might require like more argumentation on our part to say that, okay, to like enforce distinctively Christian things.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact that like atheism is unnatural is not a distinctively Christian truth. It's not a truth of grace. It's not like prior to the gospel or prior to grace, atheism is acceptable. No, like atheism is in a sense like one of the a chief sin, because it denies the source from which the rest of the law flows. So you can somehow affirm the second table, but be an atheist. The most unnatural thing you can be, is my point, is to be an atheist. Mm-hmm. So why then, if that's the ground of your your civil law, why not then apply that and suppress atheism?
Right.
So, and then again, this was, why would someone like John Locke say they should censor or suppress atheism? Well, because atheists have terrible like if you're an atheist, how can you trust them? How can you trust their oaths? How can you trust
Yeah.
their morals? How could they be so degenerate to deny the being of a god?
Mhm.
So the
Well,
being of God.
No, that's right. And you see this in the, we still call the religious test for office. Even in the states where they don't have the Trinity, or some of the states required the affirmation of divine inspiration of Scripture. So those two things are not the case in every state, but all of them have something like you need to affirm, eternity, essentially, that there's a judgment after death. You need to affirm that God exists. But for this reason, that you can't be trusted with public office if you don't believe in these natural truths, that to deny them would constitute atheism, right? So that's what they're getting at. That was just a supposition in the 18th century, and that's why you have none of the founders affirming atheism, at least publicly, and I don't think privately either. Paine would be the closest you could get to, and that's why, like, once he really went off the rails, he was not received well anymore. Like when he went to France and kind of outed himself of where what he really thought about. So I think Jefferson got in trouble for like writing an endorsement essentially of his Age of Reason. But anyway, like none of them are atheist. And that's one of I mentioned David Brewer earlier. He's like, his case is basically anytime religion is mentioned in the early documents, it's positive and mentioned positively, it's Christian, and there's no mention of positively of atheism or of any other type of religion. So even like when they choose not to talk about religion in certain cases, doesn't negate, the assumption should be that they're Christians and that this is the positive version of religion is Christianity. Anything else is rejected, and they don't feel the need to say so all the time. So, that's, I guess, another historical point for this, since we're still talking Constitution and founding or whatever they're saying. I don't know where we left them.
Yeah, let's keep it going.
Given by our Creator through a natural law of which we can legislate morality without legislating blasphemy laws for differing over the Sabbath, or whether one's a Quaker or a Baptist or a Puritan or so on and so forth.
Yeah, and I think that's an incredibly important point, that when our founders talked about the laws of nature and of nature's God, they were not promoting a theocracy or even really a theonomy in the general sense that term is understood. What they were suggesting, and this is why I don't think that the faith of the founders has any particular specific governance over the U.S. Constitution and our broader civil law. And I make that argument actually in my book, The Legal Basis for a Moral Constitution, that some of these very well-meaning authors, like, for example, David Barton, who goes out and he tries to make this claim that all of the founders were necessarily, and they had to have been, very sincere Christians. I'm saying, well, what does it matter? It doesn't, because even if they were deists, let's just say that Jefferson, we know for a fact, and that's an inarguable position, he's a deist. Well, the Constitution still refers to the laws of nature and of nature's God that is established. They're self-evident, they're observable. C.S. Lewis would have described it as discoverable truths. We can't escape the reality to which we're presented. We know that government has inherent limits. There are things that we simply can't legislate. And there are also things that we can observe from nature, from human beings have a conscience, and because we have life, we cannot arbitrarily foreclose that without due process. Thus, we outlaw murder. I mean, very basic things that are so very different as well from the libertarian view of simply the non-aggression principle, because then you get into a whole separate set of problems with defining articulable harms and all of that. And so if we take the natural law position and say, look at what the left is doing, and they're wanting to arbitrarily suggest that we can codify everything that is unnatural. Homosexual marriage, that is not natural. Children can't come from a marriage like that. That the whole gender phenomenon, and that this is a spectrum that's unnatural. We can naturally observe male versus female. All of these things, even abortion, it's a medical intervention that is unnatural to deal with.
Okay, I just, I don't know.
All right. There's a lot going on there.
I know what, like, she's setting up there. I mean, we've been long-winded ourselves, so let's give her credit some slack. But I mean, she's setting it up so that, like, the left does this, and now Christian nationalists want to do this as well. It's unnatural. I'll just reply, like, the first 3 commands, at least in the 10
Mhm.
commandments, are unnatural. I understand there's
Mhm.
dispute about the 4th and how it's natural, but the first 3 are unnatural. They should be demonstrable by, through reason and nature. And so anyway, yeah, anyway, do you have anything to say? Do you want to keep going?
No, yeah, I mean, I know I don't think she's doing this because she wants to say there's so she's affirming there is a morality, transcendent morality that's natural that you don't need, I guess we're saying special revelation for. I think she's affirming that. And that, but she keeps all the examples she's given so far are sort of these empirically observable, not ones through process of reason and sort of the you're accused of being a Thomist all the time, so I can say the Thomistic sense of participation in the law of God or in the eternal law which constitutes the natural law. So it's more of this man and a woman. It's observable. It's a biological fact. That's the law of nature, and of course it's no less than that. That's fine. But it's this very scientific kind of thing, rather than saying, well, we can reason from certain premises to the fact that a God exists, and if God, there has to be the supreme being, the unmoved mover, and therefore he deserves to be worshipped because he's the highest being, and these kinds of things. They're not really coming into play for her at this time, even as she's name checking that nature and nature's God, and not asking, well, which God would that be? What would the assumption be? I don't know. It's just it's kind of all over the place. And I know that, of course, this would be true for us too. Like some of our main concerns have to do with the litany of things, the 3 things she listed that are societal ills. Like we would agree that natural law precludes those, but I guess the fundamental difference is we just say the natural law also precludes the things that they're more public sins that they're more comfortable with now because they've been conditioned by the post-war assumptions, read into law. So I guess that would be to try to find a source of like the technical disagreement. I guess that would be one. And it could be solved by doing the reading, but
with a pregnancy. And so obviously miscarriage is a natural, unfortunate, and tragic event, but it's still a part of nature. So all of these things that the left is suggesting are inherent rights are actually unnatural, and our founders would have understood, and the American experience would have understood that we don't have to specifically ordain a state-sponsored religion that is compulsory, that includes blasphemy laws, that includes determining people as heretics, but that we can say you're free to believe in any God you want, practice religion, not totally however you want, obviously, because there are still murder laws and things like that. But you are free to exercise religion. You are free to be a part of any religion or no religion at all. But the civil government still has an objective standard on the laws of nature and of nature's God. And that seems very self-evident. Yet the Christian nationalist position mirrors in this way leftism, because the woke wants to institute blasphemy laws. If you don't say, and the government isn't compelling you to bake the cake, to create the website, to speak gender preferred pronouns, to now in California have
so now we know. So now we know the kind of the tactic here. You got the scary left and the woke, and then you got these Christian nationalists who want to essentially be the same thing. So that's kind of the rhetoric. You if you're that silly line, if you're afraid of the left, wait till you see the post-Christian right or whatever. It's kind of that same kind of thing. Yeah, and as I've already kind of explained that the sort of laws that we would be okay with in principle and I think also in prudence are just ubiquitous within our own tradition. So if you want to talk about the American experience, unless you want to say that the only experience that counts is from 1950 something on, or whenever the incorporation doctrine was, it 1945, whatever it was. So
47.
So from then on, like that's the American experience. Well, we're just trying to say, well, wait, let's take the entire experience up and take that seriously. I think that there's other things like the idea of we need a state religion. So that's one of the confusions, especially about my view, is that I think it's okay to have a state religion. I think it's okay to have a national church and all that. I don't think that's appropriate for every case. I absolutely do not think there should be given our federal arrangements, a
Mhm.
national church that's
Right.
operates out of Washington. I'm okay if
Yeah.
a state wants to say we're going to establish some kind of church,
Mhm.
and it's going to be publicly funded. I don't see that on the horizon, but I would be okay with that in principle.
Mhm.
But yeah, but I do think that in order for the law, the second table duties of the law to flourish properly, to be properly
Mhm.
ordered, there needs to be an acknowledgement among the people of the lawgiver. This goes
Mhm.
back to the basic founders principle that religion is, like, the idea of religion is necessary for a free, happy, flourishing,
Mhm.
a virtuous people. Essentially ubiquitous within that. Even Madison believed that, as I understand it. He just didn't think that state establishments would be conducive to that. He thought it would corrupt religion and make it worse and all
Mhm.
that. So yeah, I think that we, and at the same time, we can have a type of religious liberty such that, like, for most of our history, Jews were able to worship freely and have synagogues. At the same time, there was, in a holistic sense, apart from like each part, as a whole, we understood ourselves as
Mhm.
Americans as a Protestant and as a Protestant country, and there was an interest
Mhm.
in maintaining that.
Mhm.
So, and as a Christian Protestant country,
Mhm.
and you can affirm that as that's what we are as a whole, while also permitting parts of it to be kind of divergent from that, right? So you
Mhm.
don't have to think what you ascribe to the whole has to be ascribed to every part. It's just a basic
Right.
principle of
Right.
logic. So you
Yeah.
can say we are this as a whole, but also have different parts. So, and
Yeah.
that's what I would
Yeah.
say, with Muslims and Jews and kind of, like heretical sort of
Yeah.
religions as well, is you can freely worship, but we're like as a whole.
Right.
So,
Right. And something we haven't mentioned yet, and we don't have to get into because it's kind of commonplace on the whatever we are, the new Christian right or something. To recognize certain undeniable social phenomenon that are present in some regard in every society, whether so the only question is whether they'll be officially recognized or not. And one of those is, it's common to say now, is establishment. There's no neutrality, this sort of thing. Of something is going to serve this function, and you're going to have something informing the laws, and you're going to have some kind of status hierarchy based on participation in a public religion of some kind, in some way. And we could talk about that forever of how it manifests now, but it does. And so the only question is, which one it's going to be, and then whether you're going to basically say the quiet part out loud and kind of recognize it, and then act accordingly in a way that I think is more fair, because it provides more explicit notice for people. It's more obvious about the prospect and requirements of like assimilation and participation in the full civil society. So I think it's better to just say, here's the kind of establishment we have. Either this is back to Joseph's story. It's like, it could be general Christianity, it could be generally Protestant, or it could be Congregationalist. Like, that's your three tiers. So Christianity, which includes all denominations, and then you still allow, just like we combating the Puritan myths. They have room for dissenters. Like, having room for dissenters is just a fact of life also, unless you want to be
yeah.
an unjust society that is, and actually waste a lot of energy too. Like, even if it was a just crusade, like to do that. The Crusades were defensive wars anyway. But anyway, but you have to have room for dissenters, and I think it's fair to have, but you can at the same time um, be self-conscious about what you are, what you want to preserve, a certain way of life, which necessarily includes a religious aspect. In fact, it may be the central aspect. It's the glue to society. And so having some variation of establishment is not only unjust, but inevitable and preferable for it to be the true religion, to be a Christian one. And then you can get into the weeds. I mean, this is all theory land anyway, but you get into the weeds about how it's going to function, how you're going to distribute labor between the two powers in a certain way. But there's just something is going to be in that role. And all we're saying is, well, the state's duty is to because the state's going to do things to prop these things up. It's going to reward certain behavior and all this. So it's its duty to recognize true morality and true religion, and that's Christianity. So, and especially when you have a place that is historically Christian, still predominantly Christian, in fact, still predominantly and historically Protestant, that's what it should be. That doesn't affirm any sort of neocon kind of aspiration to, in a millenarian fashion, do this to the whole world. I mean, the Cotton or Davenport, whichever it is, piece we talked about earlier, he gets to the end, if you remember in the discourse, and is like, if you went over to Turkey right now, meaning in 1666 or whenever it's published, you wouldn't expect to be treated the same. You're not Turkish and you're not Muslim. And, this is the height of like the Ottoman Empire still a thing. So you're not of them. You would be, hopefully they wouldn't kill you. And that would be your best option. And you could just live there peacefully. And he's like, why, if we have the option, like as they did at the time, in a new plantation, and what's its religion supposed to be, why wouldn't you make it Christianity? This is just what a people does for themselves. And like, it's inevitable. Your expectation should be conditioned by that as to how you'll be treated. Hopefully you're treated kindly, but you're an outlier. So you act like a dissenter, and that's fine. So anyway, it's just like, it's a very realist perspective they have as well. And the effect of liberalism in the post-war period is to pretend that these realities don't exist anymore. And so then you can't actually talk about them in a reasonable, non-hysterical way.
Yeah. It's like can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. It's like we've been cut off from the sort of asking the sort of questions and that have been asked for hundreds of years. And we've been cut off from those questions very recently. I think what you pointed out with with that document, it's what's Discourse on Civil Government by either Cotton or Davenport, whoever.
It's probably Davenport. I think Francis Bremer said it's Davenport, so he should probably win. He's like the Davenport expert.
Yeah, like that document alone, even from like the very what you cite, I think it's in the beginning actually, and it's concerning the statement of the question because he's responding to an individual, a friend or something like that.
Yeah,
and he's saying, well, no, he's clarifying what the question is between them, which is not you show up someplace, you enact a certain order, that ideal order. He was saying, no, like you have to, what the statement of the question is that are the conditions appropriate? What is possible given the conditions? So you show up to Turkey, you're not going to have like a Christian polity. If you all are united in religion, you show up to Massachusetts Bay and you say, we're going to establish this order. Well, you can do that. And his argument was, well, why not do that? I think to his credit, Neil Shinvey has basically said that if you were colonizing Mars with a group of people and they all had the same religious beliefs, then in principle, or no, even according to prudence, you could establish certain laws to maintain that. So to his credit, he has affirmed that. But he doesn't think he could do that now.
Right. And if someone is just arguing that's fine. But the question then, the follow-up, and I'm friends with Neil, so it's not, he knows where I stand on this stuff. Is it's okay to do that if like you had 100% buy-in, like that's what he's thinking.
Right.
And then the next question is like, are you allowed to do things to maintain the majority buy-in? That's like where the rubber meets
to be
the road.
Exclusive.
Which literally is the scenario of New England that we set up. It's like everyone agrees. I mean, they already had non-Christians with them, even in Plymouth, like Bradford writes about some of the, punks that like are on the ship with them and stuff. But the point is like, are you allowed to then maintain it? That's the real point. And then like, also what's the threshold? Because if it's anything beneath 65%, we still have the threshold. So we still have the quorum. The population. Yeah. So I don't know.
So I think that the point being is that, we restore the conversation, see what's prudent, be a realist on the ground. That's our tradition. Sure. That's like, one of the early chapters of my dissertation, like talk about that and then say, well, the founding is a new sort of circumstances and all that. So anyway, let's keep going.
Okay.
The contemplation of child custody around parents having to affirm their child's gender or something than what they biologically are.
Sure
those are basically modern day blasphemy laws. And so the Christian
nationalists,
Lindsay and O'Fallon have talked about, and it's a popular sort of postmodern fallacy known as the Mott and Bailey. And the Mott is usually the nicer term. The Bailey is sort of the crazy term, but they're using language off of one another where it sort of sounds the same, but it's ultimately different. So what's funny is that as it relates to this, and you see the Christian nationalists talking, they'll say things like, we really want to have Christian morality in society, And then the flip side of it is they'll say things like, we want a Protestant Franco, or we think that the Constitution already really doesn't exist because look at all the ways that we've undermined it over the last 100 years. And, all of these different things. And I go, well, guys, first of all, we see your manipulations and what you're trying to do with it. Some of them on social media are just the gift that keeps on giving. So when you see some people talking about how they want to have these new foundings of the Constitution, you ask, well, what does it mean to have a new founding of the Constitution? Well, it means you have to have an undoing of the old Constitution, an unfounding of the previous sort of set of laws and fabric that bound one another together. So what does that ultimately mean? Well, when you look at what they're doing with their project, not the nice things that they're saying about the project, but the Bailey aspects of it, they want to fundamentally do away with key aspects of the Constitution. And when you follow some of them, freedom of speech will be done away with, because if they're going to enact blasphemy laws off of the things that you say, that's
I mean, we've dealt with all this before.
I guess we've dealt with all of it. Yeah.
Yeah. But I think the one thing is this like Mott and Bailey thing. Again, it's like he's taking the different comments you see on social media and thinking that they're somehow coordinated. Because he is right that there are people who will say, oh, well, Christian nationalism is just, you want to enact a Christian morality, by which they mean, in gay marriage or no more trans or whatever, no abortion, which is not, I don't mention any of those in the book on purpose because I knew people would do that. I knew they would go back and say, well, it's actually just about this and that. I don't think it's all about that, but yeah, I think he's taking these different like contradictory definitions and statements and then turning that into sort of conspiracy that we're all just kind of conspiring to make this Mott and Bailey when it's really just just Twitter. I mean, Twitter's a chaos. It's a wild west. I don't know what you want. So
fundamentally,
I agree. The only thing I was going to add is the I won't get us onto the rabbit trail, but some of the things he's mentioning offhand that are comments, again, like you said, it's Twitter, whether it's about regime cycle stuff, which is also you can easily find in such analysis in the Founders, or talking about what's been done post World War II, post Civil Rights Act, these sorts of things with the constitutional order and constitutional precedent. That I don't understand why you're not allowed to make those observations and talk about them, which is all I really see people doing. They're not like celebrating bad things that have happened or bad things that could come to fruition, but it's sort of a descriptive rather than prescriptive assessment of the current state of affairs. And then on top of that, Roach is like referring, they will say, it's the two constitutions argument. This is like Caldwell and some of the other Claremont guys, everyone's familiar. And they're saying that, and so therefore they need, if they want a new, establishment of the constitutional order, that means you have to destroy the old one. But all that's really being said is that we want to get back behind inappropriate developments and incursions from the 20th century. So I don't really understand his argument in that way, because no one's saying we want to bulldoze everything. We're saying there's been improper additions that would be good to get rid of. At the same time, if some of these things aren't addressed in more fundamental things like social unrest and all this demographics issues, whatever, foreign wars, if you don't address these things, you're going to have the continued breakdown of your society, which in classical analysis from, you can find in Adams and stuff, means you're going to have a new regime type come in, and it's an unfavorable and disruptive process, but it's just what happens. I don't understand why all that's so scary and objectionable. Right? It's scary, but I don't understand why he's making it sound like there's a bunch of people on Twitter, like you said, that are coordinated, that are plotting a coup, right? Like that's how he's making it sound. And that's, I think that's a bad faith way to put it.
Yeah. I mean, and maybe he's, some guy did say the Constitution sucks, or he went, death with it, down with the con. I mean, maybe he did see that. I've never said that. And you've never said that. But yeah, I mean, when we say that, well, I mean, if he says that, like, if we get our way and we get blasphemy laws, and that's the end of the Constitution or the death of the Constitution, then the Constitution died on arrival. It was dead on arrival because they had them at the time of the founding and for hundreds of years afterwards. So it's just like,
and saw no
again,
apparent contradiction.
But he is like, to put it in the frame of like the multiple constitutions, he is defending the latest constitution. Like he's defending that, and we are defending the original. So I guess let's keep going.
Doing away with freedom of speech or freedom of religion when they want to say things such as anybody who is a quote false teacher, heretic, blasphemer,
he likes his quote,
idolater, and they'll go on to add atheist and all the rest, that the Christian prince needs to fundamentally persecute them, and they'll say that either means imprisonment, banishment, and or death. That's a doing away of the freedom of religion. So what we had to fundamentally.
So I guess I should respond to that. It's get this all tiresome. Maybe are you tired of doing that?
Well, I mean, they're just starting to repeat themselves. But I mean,
it's 18 minutes. So that he is quoting me trying to narrow down the statement of the question or the thing at issue between modern religious liberty advocates and earlier understandings of the liberty of conscience. And so I say for like 2 pages, it is not this, it's not that, it's not this, it's not that. Here's what it is. So I say it, and I say the civil leader or civil magistrate may do these things. It's the question, meaning like that is the point at issue. If we're going to argue about this, you have to deny that, I affirm that. That's not a call for every single civil leader to go round up the Mormons or to go find the Roman Catholics and round them up and throw them in prison or put them on a ship and ship them off to Iceland or something. Like that's not like what it. And then from there you can establish a principle, and then you could say, well, how do you apply that in context? I talk about means and ends. So if the end is a flourishing of religious and civil life, then well, what's the means to that? Well, in some circumstances, and in New England, for example, it'd be like Quakers, why do you keep coming back? Get out of here. Other circumstances like our own is where we can't start rounding up everyone who is not Presbyterian or it's not this or that. We can't do that. And so we won't do that. And because that would have the opposite effect. The means would then actually would fail to achieve the end and do the opposite. It would cause civil disruption, strife, and possibly the fall of the civil order itself. So, but he doesn't think through these things, even though I've laid it out. And it makes me wonder if he's being dishonest or he's trying to do what's been going on to me for about a year, which is, hey, let's take a screenshot of this scary thing and say, Wolf believes you should, kill heretics right now. So anyway.
Yeah. I mean, it goes back to the thing they don't want to hear, which is, you have to, I say this all the time, that, you have to establish in principle before you can make concessions to context, via prudence. What evangelicals are fond of doing is starting with the concessions they've made to the current order and turning those into absolute principles. Things have happened as historical contingencies, and they want to make them, well, this is the way it's done. So they're unfamiliar with reasoning this way, and they start exactly backwards. And, I guess I would just say to him, just deal with it. It's in the tradition. You don't have to, and everything you just said, I mean, in principle, it is completely just for the civil magistrate to enforce, or rather punish, these sorts of things, heretics, blasphemers, idolaters, etc. But almost every good text that I've read in the 2 centuries basically that we're fond of, at least take notice of the prudential aspects. And this even goes, but very famous passage in Aquinas, and where he's talking about whether you should abolish brothels in Paris, in his day. And he basically concludes that any change in the law is violence. It's a violent act to change the law. It's what people are used to, especially customs. And so you can do that. You can justifiably do that because the brothels are sinful. but it's so ingrained like in the society that he says this is an example, I don't want brothels, but it's an example where it's probably more prudent to not disrupt it because it would be so disruptive that you might not recover from it and the polity might be damaged. And this is ultimately what the statesman has to consider. So like at the same time, he's writing in Deregno, to the king of Cyprus or whatever, the principled basis for like everything, here's how society begins. Here's where rule comes from. Here's the types of governments. Like you begin this way, then you get down to prudential aspects and you do the sort of advice for kings and say, ultimately you got to preserve your rule. Ultimately, you got to be stable. Ultimately, like you need to do justice to God, but you may have so on and so forth. You get it. So it's just very frustrating that this sort of approach is not so foreign. It's a little scary. The most scary thing is that it is foreign, I guess, because I don't know how you're supposed to talk about this.
Yeah, I mean, the Aquinas one that's an interesting case because you can disagree with the reasoning, but still understand the process how he went from a principle and thought of the end in mind. Like, again, all civil policy has to conduce to the good of society. And so that's why I deny that you have this like set of laws that you have to apply in every place, regardless of consequences. So it would make no sense to say we're going to have a Presbyterian state right now, and like we use the heavy hand of government to make it happen. Well, what's going to happen is everyone's going to say, no, we're not. And there's going to be strife, civil war, and it actually fails to achieve the end sought, the opposite. So, and that means you shouldn't do it. Like if you're going to destroy the Commonwealth through a law you think is righteous, then that law is actually a bad law. So don't do that.
Yeah. It's not in the situation. It's not good. I mean, this is part of where Aquinas then gets into talking about, law is supposed to lead men to virtue, but it has to do it gradually in most cases. You have to slowly try to, and the good ruler can see the end vision and figures out the incremental steps, this kind of thing. So that's a good, prudent ruler that's handed like a state of affairs. He's not at the beginning of a Commonwealth's founding. He's just given this like thing. How do you govern? But if you get to, you have sort of blank slate, whatever, you have a bigger range of options. But it doesn't preclude, certain scenarios. It's a judgment call where you do kind of just take the heat. If you're like, it's possible, it's the society isn't going to collapse. There's going to be blowback, but it's a just cause. So we would say that with like abortion, right? Banning abortion is an example of where it's justice. It's good. The outlet is there to do it. It's not overnight going to turn the country's not going to lapse into civil war, most likely over it. So you make the call and you're like, this is going to be disruptive, but it's good violence, like to do this because it's just. So you can do that with a range of things, but this is just what you were getting into with some of those initial, setting up the state of the question, but then get into later is really comes down to these. You can't give people a concrete list of what to do in a prudential according to prudence in a given situation, because it's necessarily dependent on the circumstances. Someone has to be there to make that call, and they have to know what the range of options in principle are to them based on their authority from God before they can then assess what am I able to do here for the good of the people. And I just think that's we know it's important because it's what good political philosophy texts used to address. It's where they would begin, and now they don't anymore. It's all like sentimental pietism and biblicism or something. So anyway, that was a screed, but it's very frustrating.
No,
we can leave it at that on that point.
Yeah, and for people who are on our side, when we talk about prudence, we want to be clear that it's not an excuse for action. So just because it might disrupt things, like you mentioned abortion time, and like like some women are going to wear their vagina hats in halls but so what? I mean, okay, they're there, then they go home. Like unless they're gonna somehow it's gonna cause like a civil war and overthrow. I mean, then maybe not. But you could still have a resolute will. Yeah, you're going to offend people oftentimes. Any law is gonna have probably some people who are offended by it, but you just have to have a will to do right. But at the same time, you don't want to overthrow your state. So, all right, let's keep going.
Yeah, there's a really good book by I think his last name's Henriksen. I think it was his like dissertation or something called The Immortal Commonwealth. I think it's a Cambridge Press, like it's in a series from Cambridge Press or something. It's short, it's very academic, but it's short. And it's good on many of these things, and kind of that idea that he gets at, and he's drawing from Malthusius and people.
You'll have to send that to me.
Yeah, it's good. I think I just read it last year. I have it around here somewhere. Anyway, the thing he gets at is some of these ideas. He gets on to like, when can you right of revolution and these sorts of things, lesser magistrate doctrine. But the point is, like, the conception of the Commonwealth as predating and postdating anyone alive occupying it now, and that includes the ruler. And so the of paramount importance for everybody is to preserve this almost immortal thing, which is the Commonwealth that transcends everybody. And so that should be motivating your actions, both if you ever consider rebellion against a tyrant, but also the ruling of the magistrates, of like, they should be thinking about, how do I have to maintain the longevity of the Commonwealth. I can't let it dissolve and fall apart. And so anytime you're passing laws, or on the flip side, not enforcing a law, like if you're not punishing blasphemers, what does it do? So these sort of questions, and it gets, it's much more complicated, but therefore much more interesting discourse than what like passes for those kind of considerations today. But anyway,
yeah.
Fundamentally see here is that in their project, they're almost saying we're in a post-constitutional age, and because of the fact that we have blasphemy laws given to us, we can give blasphemy laws back to them. And I go, the whole American experiment is this: we can legislate morality without giving blasphemy laws. I can legislate morality without legislating religion. I can legislate morality without being an integralist. And that's where so much of this debate ultimately comes down to. Do you want a free society, or do you want an integralist society in which blasphemy laws are given to you from the state in order to enforce church morality? Here's the interesting thing. It's which church is in control.
So it's, again, like, and freedom, the idea of freedom is again, like, we're like a broken record here, but it's like, it's post-war sort of freedom. Essentially the bifurcation he's setting up, which I don't know if he even knows it. It's the bifurcation of either you choose it, either it's pre or post-war. I know we talk about post-war a lot, but I mean, it's just, I think it's just essential to understand these things. Like, there's that's the bifurcation, and we're on one side, he's on the other. So I think she's on
at that particular time also, because that's where the whole thing is. When you look at the history of even good, solid Protestant Reformation folk, whether in England or here, when you have the power, you legislate your view. When you lose the power, they legislate that against you. So what's sauce for the goose can be sauce for the gander.
Right. And I think that it's so important to highlight that the integralist view is attempting to then strip the entire nation of all of the intrinsic rights that our founders and the Bible show are given by God and are inalienable, as our founders recognized. And so we are then going from a free society that values genuine liberty and freedom, and freedom in Christ, even as the Bible would suggest. And we're also denying the authority of Romans 13 and and
First denying the authority of Romans 13
and elsewhere that talk about how it's the civil government that carries the sword. It is not the church. And even though Christ established a little bit,
but it's so frustrating, because it's like, I mean, we're not saying that, like, the church, that's the whole point of, I don't know. It's frustrating because, like, every Protestant history would say you don't give the civil sword to the spiritual power. You don't give the spiritual power to like, everyone has said that. Like, even Roman Catholics, this goes back to Gelasius or Galasius. When was it? 500 somewhere? I forget that. Always forget the year he articulated his two swords doctrine. But anyway, it's like everyone has forever always affirmed a distinction of swords, that they have different objects and they have different penultimate ends. Different subjects. It's just, I don't know. It's like, no, why do we have to deal with this?
I don't know.
All right.
differently, obviously in Old Testament Israel. That's not what we see in the church age. And we've got to take a break right here, but I want to be back with more on Christian nationalism with Dr. Bill Roach. We'll be right back.
Legacyinvestments.com. I guess they just got double advertised. I should get money for that. Anyway, comments thus far. Are we still still able to continue?
They're just, they're circling around the same thing. And that particular segment, it's just a lot of truisms strung together. Like you sort of said, setting it up at the beginning, if this is how you would talk to a room of like layman boomers to say all the scary things that it's going to work to get them. They're probably going to buy the gold or whatever this investment ad is for. When they hear this stuff, it gets them.
That would have been perfect. Yeah, I think. Yeah, Jenna, I would recommend. I'm being a jerk now, but
it's like that. That's just it. Just
I don't want to be an ass. I'm just trying to have fun. Yeah, but all right.
No, it's all fun. It's you have to be able to laugh at this stuff, or it's too depressing to go carry on. So. Yeah, I'm not hearing. There's not anything new, not just in the conversation generally, but from both of them at this point. They just have kept circling the same, point. I guess now the crescendo is really setting up the dichotomy, and they're just going to say, the one side denies liberty, whatever that means, it's just supposed to mean something to you, and it's sentimental. Freedom in Christ, apparently, the Bible. They're just saying things. It's like a bad politician.
Who knew that the freedom in Christ meant that the perfect order was the post-Warren Court American constitutionalism? Who knew like that? It took that long, 1930s or whatever it was, the 30 years to enact finally the perfect
blessing of liberty. It's an immense blessing of liberty that we live in the perfectly gospel-centered and oriented society ever. And we shame on us for being underappreciative of what we have.
Yeah, if only 1550, England, going through Reformation. If only they knew it was actually the 1980s was the pinnacle of Christian.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm being asked again. So let's get.
And they had examples similar to some of these things, and at least in theory, even if not in practice, they knew of certain other alternatives, maybe not fully worked out, and they all consciously rejected them. That's the thing I get annoyed with all the time. Is you see this in certain radical two kingdoms guys or whatever. That's like the it's uninterrogated assumptions is what the reformers carry over. They almost got everything right. The Westminster Confession was almost perfect, except for these uninterrogated Constantinian assumptions that they carried in. And now that we got rid of those, we've completed the Reformation, always Semper Reformanda, all this stuff. It just frustrates me to no end because they, one, it would be a specious argument anyway, but two, they did actually consider alternatives and write about them and say in the sort of classical style, trying to be in this long conversation about types of regimes, models, how liberty is supposed to be used, freedom, whatever, human freedom, just rule, sovereignty. They spilled a lot of ink on this stuff, and everyone pretends like it was basically unaddressed until Russell Moore decided to take up his mighty pen or something and tell us all what the. Anyway, so it's just very frustrating. So please do the reading.
I should have titled this.
It should just be called "Please Do the Reading."
When we look at this whole issue, we have to look at it historically. And when you look at it historically,
let's
you're going to see
history.
many of the vices that it can actually give to us. And we see how these things function. We've seen other groups within the United States try to do this. For example, go to Dearborn, Michigan. What are they trying to do in Dearborn, Michigan? You hear,
he brings up the Muslims.
The calls for prayer every day. You see people taking over city council.
I forgot about that.
You see people legislating Muslim Quranic belief.
I guess I can give him credit for consistency. I think. I want to give credit to the Muslims because they're acting according to these good principles, but they're just wrong. They have their false religion. Exactly. I wish that we as a Christian people would do the same thing they're doing. Yeah, they have this a confidence They say that this, well, we're the majority, and that's enough. We're going to enact our religion. I mean, I respect that, even though it's obviously false.
Totally. Yeah, I cited the William Prent example earlier, which is his it's his treatise on Christian magistry, I think is the title of it. One of his longer like pamphlets, but he says the exact same thing. He's just like, this is inevitable. All good societies do it. It's laudatory in the sense that it's according to true principles of governance, and he uses both contemporary and biblical examples to illustrate that kind of like at length. So I would say the same thing. I mean, I saw in the news earlier this week that like a similar Muslim community, very small, I think it's also in Michigan, banned all pride flags. And there's like nothing anybody could do about it because they control the council that's like 10 people or something. Like they just got all the seats. It's this little bitty town. And they said what was hilarious is they actually cited principles in their public statement of religious liberty of the community. So the community, which is a much more, is a way to view religious liberty in a way that is much more in tune actually with 18th century thought in this regard, that the founders would have been very aware of, is like there is liberty, certainly in their private belief in these things, as long as they're quiet and peaceable. But even more importantly, perhaps, is the liberty of communities to be self-determinative in this way and to act according to those determinations, as long as it's on good true principles and for good and true ends. So that's what this little community is doing. They're just like, no more pride. To be fair, I think they even banned other types of flags other than the American flag. Or like just none of it, like just get rid of it. But they cited the pride thing in general. They're like, we don't want this around. It's bad, and it offends us as a community, so it's gone. So it's great.
Yeah,
great. I don't know.
So I mean,
anyway,
it's that like one of my. I mean, this gives me an opportunity to say like one of the things I want to do with the book is to provide a theological basis for Christians to have the same type of confidence, theologically, philosophically, that Muslims have to enact that kind in their local jurisdiction that they control. Because we don't have that. We used to. I mean, you're reading some of these very self-assured, confident Protestants in our history, which they died very recently. It's like, wow, we used to be like this, and now look at us. It's horrible. We're pathetic. I think he's going to continue
into
Muslim
the
bashing here.
Experiment. And what are they ultimately doing? They're undermining the freedom of religion through their jihad on the Western.
Oh, here he comes. He's going to get me.
Legislative.
He's going to get me on this one.
Well, what if we were to do that as a form of Christians? They might say, and I go, well, that's precisely in one sense what Christian nationalists are trying to do. So let me give you a little quote here. This comes from Stephen Wolf's book. And listen for one key word, and you're going to know it when you hear it.
Very scary.
And to draw the parallel, it says this: suppressing false religion in one's own land can be called a holy war.
There it is.
Where do we hear that? How do we translate holy war into Arabic? It's a jihad in that regard. For the intended effects is the elimination of sacrilege. In our time, the suppression of false religion is not an end in itself, but a means and matter of prudence.
See, there you go. I like that line. We'll end on that line because that line is
that's
exactly.
A good one. That's a good one, actually.
I wonder if he even realizes that he's that's like the most important quote. So yeah, I do say, because I think that's in the section where I talk about like holy commonwealth, like in a sense that if you like a people like clearing out like the sacrilege from their community, like I think to say no rainbow flags on public buildings, that is a holy act. Like that's there's something to that, and so I get that line can be scary, but if you take it into the broad the argument of my book, broadly speaking, it's but I mean there is something in a certain condition, like if you're like, we're going to clear this idolatrous crap out from our public spaces, and we're going to reestablish ourselves as a Christian people. there is a
Mhm.
sort of holy act in that, and so whatever.
I mean, you used to throw around this kind of language, all the time. This kind of more. It sounds more charged to us today because we're conditioned by more secular expectations, and of course, the myth of in the liberal project as a sort of conflict mitigation model, as we understand liberalism today. One of the myths that props that up is that religion and religious differences were the cause of basically all the strife that predated the liberal triumph. That the religion, it's irrational. It used to cause irrational conflicts, even if you believe it. That's good. It might be true, but it's irrational to have conflicts over it. It certainly hasn't ceased wars, and it certainly hasn't ceased empire. So both of those were utter failures if that's what it was supposed to do. But it has conditions you to where you think publicly these things are not worth aggressive action on because they don't ultimately matter, which is a total psyop. And I've cited this before from letters Jefferson had to friends in like the early 19th century, where he's saying, the main thing to do, the best strategy. I think this was in the review of Andrew Walker's book. I put this in there. It was like the best thing to do to superstitions, like and denominational strife, is to treat it with indifference, so that it loses all public importance and it dies, and then we'll be free of it. We don't need that, and it causes problems. And it's essentially what we've done. And this kind of rhetoric from him perpetuates what is actually a myth of like religious violence is the only bad thing about the past several hundred years, and affirms a secular liberal posture towards the public sphere, as if there can't be any spiritual significance to things going on there. And I do think that contradicts the Bible, actually. So and not to mention the Protestant tradition and even the Protestant ethos, which you mentioned, of sort of confidence, self-assertiveness, willingness to stake out a claim for the public morality and act accordingly, is totally gone. So I would love to see Protestants regain that confidence as well.
Yeah, that's what I hope we can achieve. So it's been like
I'm
2 hours and
at this point.
no, it's like no, that's not the reason, but it's like two hours and 40 minutes. We've got through like 25 minutes of this. There's more to go. I think they begin kind of repeating themselves at this point. So
I'm probably repeating myself at this point too. So
yeah, I think we're both going to end up just well, whatever. If 2 hours and 40 minutes of Time and Klein's commentary is I'm sure people are loving it. So but all right, well, I guess you want to call it a night. It's getting late.
Yeah, we should call it.
You got to drink another IPA and go to bed.
No, it's already late. I do got to go to bed. I didn't even get through. It wasn't until, like I said, the Quakers reminded me that I had it here, so I was late getting to it. But they get me so exercised, I needed to calm down. Anyway, this is good. We didn't get through. I listened to that whole thing earlier, and yes, they do it at some point just get much more repetitive. I think I had a few minutes to go at the end. It got boring, but we've covered the highlights, and
yeah,
we've sufficiently screeded on all the
and we've been pretty nice. I mean, we've stuck to the evidence, but
we stuck to the material.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's call it a night. So whoever's still out there in the way out there, thanks for listening. And yeah, probably more to come. So all right. Yeah. All right. Bye-bye.